They said she was ruined, damaged goods, a woman no decent man would touch. The town of Bitter Creek had made their judgment, and Eliza Moore wore their verdict like a scarlet brand. But when Mayor Hutchins dumped her at the loneliest ranch in Montana Territory, neither he nor Eliza knew that the broken cowboy living there understood rejection better than anyone. What happened next would shake the foundations of everything that small-minded town believed about redemption, love, and second chances. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The storm had been building all afternoon, bruising the Montana sky with shades of purple and black that promised violence. Ethan Cole sat motionless on his horse at the ridge overlooking his ranch, watching the weather roll in from the west like an army preparing for siege. His hand rested on the rifle across his saddle, still warm from recent use. 3 cattle thieves had learned today that stealing from Ethan Cole was a mistake they wouldn't make twice. 2 had fled with fresh wounds to remember him by. The 3rd wouldn't be stealing anything ever again. Ethan didn't feel proud of that fact. He didn't feel much of anything anymore. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain and sagebrush. His gelding, a battle-scarred roan named Judge, shifted beneath him, anxious to get to shelter before the heavens opened. Ethan gave him his head, and they descended toward the cabin that had been home for the past 6 years, though calling it home felt like a generous interpretation of the word. Home implied warmth, family, laughter echoing off log walls. Ethan's cabin had none of those things. He'd built it with his own hands after the war, after Sarah, after everything that mattered had been buried in graves too numerous to count. The structure was solid, functional, and utterly devoid of comfort beyond basic survival. One room with a stone fireplace, a rope bed in the corner, a table he'd built from pine, and shelves that held ammunition, tools, and very little else. No photographs, no mementos. Nothing that could remind him of what he'd lost. The first drops of rain hit his face as he approached, cold and hard as thrown pebbles. That's when he saw it. Smoke, rising from his chimney in a thin gray ribbon that the wind immediately shredded. Ethan's entire body went rigid. His hand moved to his Colt, thumb automatically checking the hammer. He hadn't left a fire burning. He never did. Waste of wood, and besides, he'd grown accustomed to cold the same way he'd grown accustomed to loneliness, as a condition of existence rather than a problem to be solved. Someone was in his cabin. Judge sensed the tension and his ears flattened. Ethan dismounted 50 yards out, ground-tying the horse behind a stand of aspen. The rain was coming harder now, turning the dusty earth to mud. He approached on foot, moving with the practiced silence of a man who'd spent 4 years hunting and being hunted across Virginia and Tennessee. The cabin's single window glowed with firelight. Through the rain-streaked glass, he could make out movement inside. A figure, small, moving back and forth in front of the hearth with purposeful efficiency. Not thieves, then. Thieves didn't build fires and make themselves comfortable. They grabbed what they could carry and ran. Ethan's jaw clenched. After the day he'd had, tracking rustlers through 15 miles of rough country and putting a bullet in a man's chest, he was in no mood for mysteries. He wanted whiskey, silence, and the oblivion of sleep. Instead, he had an intruder who'd made themselves right at home. He checked the Colt one more time, then kicked the door open. The woman at his stove didn't scream, didn't drop the pan she was holding, didn't even flinch. She simply turned her head, met his eyes with a gaze that was utterly calm, and said, "You're late. Supper's almost ready." For several seconds, Ethan could only stare. The woman was young, mid-20s, he guessed, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun that revealed a face that might have been pretty if it wasn't so carefully composed into an expression of complete neutrality. She wore a plain gray dress that had seen better days, the fabric worn at the elbows and hem. Her hands, he noticed, showed evidence of hard work. Not the soft hands of a town lady, but the capable hands of someone who knew labor. "Who the hell are you?" Ethan finally managed, rain dripping from his hat brim onto his floor. "Eliza Moore." She turned back to the stove, stirring whatever was in the pan. The smell of salt pork and beans filled the cabin. "And you're Ethan Cole. You're letting the rain in." Ethan stood there, gun still drawn, trying to process the absolute audacity of this woman cooking in his cabin like she had every right to be there. Miss Moore, I don't know how things work wherever you come from, but in Montana territory, breaking into a man's home, I didn't break in. The door was unlocked. She tasted whatever she was cooking, added a pinch of something from a small cloth bag. And before you throw me out into the storm, you should know that Mayor Hutchins sent me. Said you needed help around the place. Hutchins. Ethan spat the name like it tasted bad. That interfering son of a... He caught himself, though he couldn't say why he bothered being polite. I don't need help. I don't want help. And I sure as hell didn't ask for some woman to come out here and what? Eliza turned to face him fully now, and for the first time he saw something beyond calm in her expression. Something that looked almost like challenge. Cook your meals? Clean this place? Maybe make it slightly less depressing than a grave? Get out. No. The word hung in the air between them like a thrown gauntlet. Rain hammered against the roof, and thunder rumbled in the distance. Ethan's finger was still on the trigger of his Colt, but pointing a gun at an unarmed woman felt wrong in a way that even shooting a cattle thief didn't. I said get out, he repeated, his voice dropping to the dangerous quiet that usually made men reconsider their choices. Eliza didn't budge. Where exactly would you have me go, Mr. Cole? Back to town, where they've made it abundantly clear I'm not welcome? Into this storm, which will likely kill me before I make it a mile? Or perhaps you'd like me to simply disappear into the earth and save everyone the trouble? There was something in the way she said it, not pleading, not desperate, but with a bitter resignation that Ethan recognized because he'd heard it in his own voice often enough. The sound of someone who'd stopped expecting mercy from the world. He holstered his gun. Why did Hutchins send you here? Because I needed work, and you, apparently, need a housekeeper. He thought we could solve each other's problems while keeping me far enough from town that my presence wouldn't offend the delicate sensibilities of Bitter Creek's upstanding citizens. What did you do to offend them? Eliza's laugh was sharp and humorless. I existed, Mr. Cole. I had the audacity to exist in a way that didn't conform to their expectations. She turned back to the stove. But I imagine you understand something about that. Living out here alone, keeping company with nothing but cattle and ghosts. The observation was too accurate, too pointed. Ethan felt his defenses slam back into place. You don't know anything about me. I know you haven't had a decent meal in months. I know this cabin hasn't been properly cleaned since it was built. I know you've got blood on your sleeve and a look in your eyes that says, whatever happened today, it wasn't good. She ladled beans onto 2 tin plates. I know enough. Ethan looked down at his sleeve. She was right. Blood from the rustler had sprayed across his arm when the man went down. He hadn't even noticed until now. I can't pay you, he said finally. Not much anyway. I've got enough to keep the ranch running, but I'm not a wealthy man. I'm not asking for wealth. I'm asking for a place to sleep and food to eat. Anything beyond that is more than I have now. You're running from something. It wasn't a question. Eliza met his eyes again, and this time he saw past the careful composure to something raw underneath. Pain, maybe. Or shame. Or both. We're all running from something, Mr. Cole. Some of us just have farther to run than others. The thunder was closer now, shaking the cabin's walls. Ethan's instinct was to refuse, to send her away, to maintain the isolation that had been his armor for 6 years. But standing there, dripping rainwater onto his floor, looking at this woman who'd somehow managed to make his cabin smell like a home, even if only for a moment, he found he couldn't force the words out. Maybe he was tired. Maybe the shooting today had taken more out of him than he wanted to admit. Maybe he recognized something in Eliza Moore that reminded him too much of himself, someone barely holding together, running from a past that wouldn't stay buried. 1 week, he said. Trial basis. You keep the place clean, cook the meals, and stay out of my way. After a week, we'll see. Eliza nodded once, sharp and businesslike. Agreed. Now sit down and eat before it gets cold. I need to tend my horse. Already done. Found him tied behind the aspens, got him settled in the barn with feed and water. Ethan blinked. You went out in this storm too. The animal was standing in the rain because you were too stubborn to come inside. Someone had to show some sense. She set both plates on the table. Besides, I've been in worse weather with worse prospects. A little Montana rain won't kill me. Despite himself, Ethan felt the corner of his mouth twitch. Not quite a smile, he'd almost forgotten what those felt like, but something close. You always this bossy? Only when I'm trying to keep fools from dying of stubbornness or starvation. Sometimes both. She sat down at the table without waiting for him. Are you going to eat? Or would you prefer to stand there glaring at me all night? Ethan hung his gun belt on the peg by the door, shrugged out of his wet coat, and sat down across from her. The beans were good, better than anything he'd cooked for himself in months. The salt pork was crispy at the edges, seasoned with something that tasted like sage. They ate in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the scrape of spoons on tin and the storm raging outside. Ethan found himself watching her from under his brow. She ate with quiet efficiency, no wasted movement, no pretense of delicate appetite. A working woman's meal, consumed with the practical understanding that food was fuel, not entertainment. Where'd you come from? He asked finally. Originally, Illinois. Springfield area. My father was a clerk in a law office. She didn't look up from her plate. That life ended a long time ago. How'd you end up in Montana? Eliza's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. For a moment, Ethan thought she wouldn't answer. Then she set the spoon down with careful precision. I came west to marry a man I'd been writing letters to for 8 months, a merchant named Thomas Graves. He promised me a good life, a home, a future. Her voice was perfectly level, as if she was reciting facts from a newspaper. When I arrived in Bitter Creek 3 months ago, I discovered that Thomas Graves already had a wife, a real wife, married for 5 years with 2 children. My letters, my travel expenses, my expectations, all of it was apparently an amusement for him, a way to pass the time. Ethan's jaw tightened. What happened? I confronted him, publicly, in front of his wife and half the town. Made quite a scene from what I'm told. The ghost of a bitter smile crossed her face. Thomas, being a pillar of the community and a man of considerable charm, convinced everyone that I was a delusional woman who'd fabricated our correspondence. Showed them forged letters supposedly from me, making claims that were inappropriate. Painted me as unstable, desperate, and morally compromised. And they believed him. Of course they believed him. He was Thomas Graves, respected businessman. I was nobody, a stranger with no family, no connections, no proof beyond letters he'd destroyed. Within a week, I couldn't find lodging anywhere in town, couldn't find work, couldn't even buy supplies without people crossing the street to avoid me. Ethan felt a familiar anger rising in his chest, the same anger that had driven him during the war, the same anger that had made him put a bullet in that rustler earlier today. The anger at injustice, at cruelty, at the way powerful people crush the powerless without consequence. Hutchins knew all this when he sent you here? Hutchins wanted me gone. I was an embarrassment, a reminder that one of his town's leading citizens was either a scoundrel or the victim of a madwoman's delusions. Either way, I made people uncomfortable. This was his solution. She picked up her spoon again. Send me to the loneliest ranch in the territory, to a man with a reputation for violence and isolation. If I disappeared into obscurity, everyone would be relieved. And if I turned you away? Then I'd have walked until I found somewhere else that would take me, or until I couldn't walk anymore. Either outcome would have suited Hutchins fine. The casual way she said it, the acceptance of her own potential death as just another possible outcome, struck Ethan harder than it should have. He recognized that tone because he'd used it himself countless times. The voice of someone who'd stopped fighting for their own survival because survival seemed less important than simply getting through each day. Why didn't you go back to Illinois, he asked. Because there's nothing there for me. My father died 2 years ago. My mother passed when I was 16. I have a brother in Chicago, but we haven't spoken since he told me that traveling west to marry a stranger was the most foolish thing he'd ever heard. She met Ethan's eyes. He was right, of course, but pride keeps a person from crawling back to those who warned them, doesn't it? Ethan understood that too. Pride and stubbornness, they were sometimes the only things that kept you moving forward when everything else was gone. This trial week, Eliza said, changing the subject with visible effort. What are your expectations? Don't burn the cabin down. Don't steal from me. Don't ask me questions I don't want to answer. He scraped up the last of his beans. Beyond that, I don't care what you do. And where will I sleep? Ethan hadn't thought that far ahead. His cabin had exactly one bed, one room. He looked around as if furniture might spontaneously materialize to solve his problem. I'll sleep in the barn, he said finally. Don't be ridiculous. You'll sleep in your own bed. I'll make do with blankets by the fire. I'm not putting a woman on the floor while I pump Mr. Cole. Eliza's voice cut through his protest like a blade. I've slept in worse places than a warm floor near a fire. In fact, I've slept in barns, in abandoned wagons, and once in a root cellar when I couldn't find anywhere else. Your hospitality, such as it is already more than I expected. I'll take the floor and be grateful for it. The steel in her voice told Ethan that arguing would be pointless. This woman had survived things that would break most people, and she'd done it by being practical rather than precious about her circumstances. Fine, he conceded, but tomorrow I'll build you a proper bunk. Won't take more than a few hours. That's not necessary. It is if you're staying. I won't have it said that Ethan Cole makes women sleep on the ground. Eliza's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Then I accept. Thank you. They finished the meal in silence. Afterward, Eliza collected the plates and washed them in the bucket of water she'd apparently hauled from the pump outside. Ethan sat at the table, trying not to watch her move around his cabin with the kind of easy efficiency that suggested she'd been doing this her whole life, making spaces livable, making do with whatever was available. The storm had settled into a steady rain, drumming on the roof with hypnotic persistence. Ethan found himself relaxing despite his better judgment. The warmth from the fire, the sound of rain, the simple presence of another human being, it was almost pleasant. Almost. I should tell you something, Eliza said, not turning from the dishes. Since we're being honest about situations. Ethan tensed. Here it comes, he thought. The real story. The actual reason she was desperate enough to come to a place like this. Thomas Graves didn't just destroy my reputation, she continued, her voice quiet but steady. He destroyed my belief that I could trust my own judgment. For 8 months I read his letters and believed I knew him. Believed I understood who he was, what he wanted, what our life together would be. I was so certain, Mr. Cole. So absolutely convinced that I'd found something real. She finally turned to face him, and in the firelight Ethan could see the tracks of old tears on her face. Not fresh, not falling now, but the evidence of grief that had been cried out long ago. When I discovered the truth, it wasn't just that he'd lied. It was that I'd been so thoroughly, completely wrong about everything. About him, about my future, about my ability to see things clearly. And if I could be that wrong about something so important, how can I trust myself about anything? Ethan understood that particular brand of self-doubt. After Sarah died, after he'd left her alone on the farm while he went to fight in a war that took everything and gave back nothing but nightmares. He'd questioned every decision he'd made, every choice that led to her being buried in Tennessee soil while he came back to nothing. You can't, he said simply. Trust yourself, I mean, not completely. None of us can. We're all just guessing, hoping we get it right more often than we get it wrong. That's a bleak philosophy. It's an honest one. Eliza wiped her hands on a cloth, then moved to the corner where she'd apparently stacked her few belongings, a worn carpet bag and a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. From the bundle, she pulled 2 blankets and began arranging them near the hearth. What about you? She asked. What's your story, Mr. Cole? What brings a man to a place like this, living alone, wanting nothing to do with the world? The war, Ethan said. Then, because that seemed insufficient, he added, and what came after? Which war? Does it matter? They all end the same way. Dead friends, burned farms, and the kind of memories that don't fade no matter how much whiskey you pour on them. Eliza nodded slowly. You lost someone. I lost everyone. The words came out harsher than he intended. My wife, my parents, my brother, the farm I grew up on. Everything I thought I was fighting to preserve, I came back to find gone or ruined beyond recognition. I'm sorry. Don't be. Sorry doesn't change anything. Ethan stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. I'm turning in. Fire needs another log before bed. He moved to the woodpile by the door, selected a thick piece of oak, and placed it carefully in the hearth. The fire crackled and popped, sending up a shower of sparks. When he turned back, Eliza had arranged her blankets and was sitting on them, unlacing her worn boots. Mr. Cole, she said softly, I know you didn't ask for this. Didn't ask for me, but I promise I'll earn my keep. I'll work hard, stay out of your way, and when the week is up, if you want me gone, I'll go without complaint. Ethan looked at her, this woman who'd been betrayed, discarded, and sent to the edge of nowhere, yet still managed to sit there with her spine straight and her dignity intact. Part of him wanted to send her away right now, tonight, before she became real to him, before she became something more than a stranger taking up space in his cabin. But a larger part, the part that remembered what it felt like to be truly alone, couldn't quite bring himself to do it. Get some sleep, he said instead. Cattle need checking at dawn, which means we're up before sunrise. If you're going to work here, you keep ranch hours. Understood. Ethan moved to his bed, pulling off his boots and gun belt. He lay down fully clothed, a habit from the war that he'd never broken, and stared at the ceiling. The fire cast dancing shadows across the rough-hewn beams. He could hear Eliza settling into her own blankets, the rustle of fabric, the soft sound of her breathing. For the first time in 6 years, Ethan Cole fell asleep to the sound of another person in his home. He didn't know whether that was a good thing or a terrible mistake. The dream came, as it always did, in fragments. Sarah's face, laughing at something he'd said. The farm in Tennessee, green and golden in the summer sun. His brother James, alive and whole, before Gettysburg made him into a memory. Then the transition, the way dreams twisted reality, and suddenly he was back in the war. The smell of gunpowder and blood, the screaming of wounded horses, the face of the first man he'd killed, a boy really, no more than 17, looking surprised that the world could end so quickly. Then Sarah again, but different now, pale and still, lying in the bedroom of the farmhouse he'd never see again. The fever had taken her while he was fighting for a cause that felt increasingly meaningless with every letter that found him on the march. By the time he got the news, by the time he deserted and rode home through Union and Confederate lines alike, she'd been buried for 3 weeks. He'd stood at her grave in the rain reading the simple marker his neighbor had carved, Sarah Cole, beloved wife, 1838 to 1863. 25 years old. Dead because there was no one to care for her when the sickness came. Dead because her husband was playing soldier hundreds of miles away. In the dream, the grave opened and Sarah sat up, dirt falling from her burial dress. She looked at him with hollow eyes and asked, "Why weren't you here?" Ethan woke with a start, his heart hammering. For a disoriented moment, he didn't know where he was. Then reality reasserted itself. The cabin, Montana, the present day. The dream faded but left its residue of guilt and grief. Gray light filtered through the window. Dawn, or close enough. He sat up slowly, every muscle protesting. He'd slept in his clothes again, and his body was making him pay for it. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw Eliza's form near the hearth. She was already awake, already moving, feeding the fire with practiced efficiency. "Morning," she said without turning around. "Coffee's almost ready." Ethan grunted something that might have been thanks and pulled on his boots. His Colt went on his hip as automatically as breathing, another war habit that had become permanent. He splashed water from the basin on his face, the cold shocking away the last remnants of the dream. When he turned around, Eliza was pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. She handed him one without ceremony. "You talk in your sleep," she said matter-of-factly. Ethan felt his defenses slam back into place. "What did I say?" "Mostly names. Sarah, James, sometimes just fragments that didn't make sense." She took a sip of her own coffee. "War dreams? None of your business." "Fair enough." She didn't seem offended. "I talk in my sleep too, apparently, or I used to back when I slept near other people. They said I bargained with God, apologized to my father, and once recited an entire recipe for apple pie." Despite himself, Ethan felt his mouth twitch again. Apple pie? My mother's recipe. I haven't made it in years, but apparently my sleeping self remembers every detail. She set her cup down. The point is, we all carry things we can't put down, even in sleep. No judgment here. Ethan drank his coffee. It was strong and bitter, the way he liked it. Outside, he could hear the morning sounds of the ranch, cattle lowing in the distance, birds starting their day, the whisper of wind through the grass. I need to ride the fence line today, he said. Check for damage from the storm. There's bread in the box and some dried venison if you get hungry. I'll be back around midday. I'll come with you. No. Why not? Because fence riding is hard work, not a Sunday stroll. And because I work alone. Eliza met his eyes with that steady, unflinching gaze that was already becoming familiar. Mr. Cole, if I'm going to work on this ranch, I need to know the property. I need to understand what needs doing and how things work. You can teach me while we ride, or I can fumble around in ignorance and make costly mistakes. Your choice. The logic was sound, even if Ethan didn't like it. And truth be told, having an extra pair of hands for fence repair would make the job faster. Can you ride? He asked. Well enough. Meaning? Meaning I won't fall off, but I won't be winning any races either. I learned as a girl, but it's been a while. Ethan sighed, already regretting this. Fine. There's a mare in the barn, gentle enough for a rusty rider. We leave in 20 minutes. Dress warm and bring water. Eliza nodded and went to her carpet bag, pulling out items with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to pack light and smart. Ethan busied himself with his own preparations, checking his rifle, filling his canteen, gathering tools for fence repair. 20 minutes later, they were mounted and riding east toward the section of fence that always took the worst beating from storms. Eliza sat her horse competently enough, if not gracefully. The mare, a dappled gray named Clementine, was patient with her rider's stiffness. The morning was cool and clear, the storm having scrubbed the sky to a brilliant blue. Water still stood in puddles and the grass sparkled with leftover rain. It was beautiful country, vast and rolling, with the mountains visible in the distance like sleeping giants. They rode in silence for the first mile. Ethan kept glancing over, expecting Eliza to complain about the pace or the cold or the work ahead. She did none of those things, just kept her seat and her silence, watching the land roll past with an expression that might have been appreciation. Your ranch is larger than I expected, she said eventually. 600 acres, give or take. About 200 head of cattle, though I lost a dozen to those rustlers yesterday. Maybe more. Is rustling common out here? Common enough. Men get desperate, especially when winter's coming. They figure a few head of cattle won't be missed. His jaw tightened. They're wrong. The mayor said you had a violent reputation. The mayor talks too much. He said you killed 3 men last year in a dispute over water rights. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was flat, emotionless. 2 men, not 3. And it wasn't a dispute. They tried to poison my creek to drive my cattle off so they could claim the land. I gave them a chance to walk away. They chose to draw on me instead. That was their mistake, not mine. And yesterday, with the rustlers? 1 dead, 2 wounded. Again, their choice, not mine. I don't look for violence, Miss Moore, but I don't run from it either. Can't afford to. Not out here. Show weakness once and every hard case in the territory will think you're easy pickings. Eliza was quiet, processing this. You don't seem to feel bad about it. Would feeling bad bring them back? Make them better people? Change what they tried to do? He shook his head. I feel what I need to feel in the moment, anger mostly, that I have to deal with thieves instead of doing honest work. After that, I move on. Guilt's a luxury for people with the time to indulge it. That's a hard way to live. It's the only way I know anymore. They reached the fence line around mid-morning. As Ethan had suspected, a section about 30 yards long had been knocked down by a fallen tree during the storm. The posts were intact, but the wire was tangled and useless. He dismounted and began assessing the damage. Eliza slid off Clementine with somewhat less grace, but managed to keep her feet. She stood watching him work for a minute, then asked, What can I do? Hold wire while I string it, and don't let go unless you want to lose fingers. For the next 3 hours, they worked in tandem. Ethan cut away the damaged wire, reset posts where needed, and strung new wire from the supply he'd brought. Eliza held, pulled, and tied off sections as directed. She didn't complain when the wire bit into her leather gloves, didn't fuss when mud splashed on her dress, didn't slow down even when Ethan could see her arms shaking from the effort of holding tension on the line. "You've done this before," he observed, watching her tie off a section with competent knots. "My father owned some land outside Springfield, not a proper ranch, but enough to need fencing. He believed daughters should learn practical skills alongside sons, even if society thought otherwise." She tested the tension on the wire, nodded with satisfaction. "I also learned basic carpentry, how to butcher a hog, and how to shoot a rifle, though I'm admittedly not very good at the last one. Useful skills for a ranch. Useless skills for a lady, according to most people. My mother despaired of ever making me proper." "What happened to the land?" "Sold after my father died to pay his debts. Turns out being a clerk doesn't pay as well as being a lawyer, and he'd made some poor investments trying to give us a better life. I used my portion of what was left to buy a train ticket west and a trunk full of hope." The bitterness in her voice was carefully controlled. The hope didn't travel well. They finished the fence repair just after noon. Ethan stepped back to inspect their work, then gave a satisfied nod. "Good enough. It'll hold. That's high praise coming from you, I suspect. I don't waste words on false compliments. Work's either done right or it's not. This is right." They ate a cold lunch sitting on a boulder overlooking a small creek that cut through the property. Ethan shared his dried venison and the bread Eliza had found in his cabin. The water from the creek was cold and clean, tasting of minerals and mountain snow. "Tell me about the ranch," Eliza said between bites. "How did you end up here?" "After the war, I drifted west. Worked as a hired gun for a while, guarding wagon trains and such. Saved my money. When I got to Montana, I found this land and bought it cheap from a widow who couldn't manage alone. Built the cabin, bought some cattle, and tried to forget everything that came before." "Has it worked? The forgetting?" "No, but the trying keeps me busy." Eliza smiled faintly. "That's as honest an answer as I've ever heard." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the creek flow past. A pair of hawks circled overhead, riding the thermal currents. The sun was warm on Ethan's face, and he felt some of the constant tension in his shoulders ease slightly. "Can I ask you something personal?" Eliza said. "You can ask. I might not answer. Why did the mayor think sending me here was a good idea? Not from his perspective, I understand that, but from yours. What made him think you'd accept a housekeeper?" Ethan tossed a pebble into the creek, watching the ripples spread. "Last winter was hard. I got sick. Pneumonia, the doctor thought. Came close to dying in that cabin, alone. By the time I could ride to town again, I looked like hell. Lost 30 pounds, weak as a kitten. Hutchins got it in his head that I needed someone to look after the place. Make sure I didn't die alone in the wilderness like some hermit. But you refused. Every time he brought it up, told him to mind his own business." He picked up another pebble, turned it over in his fingers. "Guess he decided to force the issue by sending you out without asking. And you still almost sent me away last night." "Should have. Why didn't you?" Ethan looked at her then, really looked at her. In the afternoon sunlight, with her hair slightly disheveled from the morning's work and dirt smudging her cheek, Eliza Moore looked nothing like the broken woman who'd been cooking at his stove the night before. She looked capable, strong, real. "Because you reminded me of someone," he said quietly. "Your wife?" "No, me." He stood before she could respond to that, gathering up the remains of their lunch. "We should head back. Got other work to do before dark." They rode back to the ranch in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the morning's ride. Something had shifted between them. Some invisible barrier had thinned slightly. Ethan wasn't sure if that was good or dangerous, but for now, he was too tired to care. When they reached the barn, Ethan showed Eliza how to properly unsaddle and curry a horse. She learned quickly, her hands gentle but firm with Clementine. While they worked, he found himself explaining small details about ranch life. How often the barn needed mucking, where the good grazing areas were, which cattle had a tendency to wander. It felt strange talking about his life like this. He'd grown so accustomed to silence that conversation felt like a rusty skill being forced back into service. That evening, Eliza made supper from the supplies she'd found in his cabin. More beans, but this time with actual seasoning and some hardtack softened in the pot. As they ate, she asked questions about the cattle, the land, the seasons. Ethan found himself answering more fully than he intended, sharing knowledge he hadn't realized he'd been holding on to. After supper, he kept his word and spent an hour building a simple bunk frame in the corner opposite his bed. It wasn't fancy, just pine boards and rope supports, but it would keep her off the floor and give her some privacy. There, he said, testing the stability. It'll hold. Eliza ran her hand over the rough wood, and for the first time since arriving, her careful composure cracked slightly. Her eyes were wet when she looked at him. Thank you, she said softly. You didn't have to do this. Said I would. I keep my word. Still. Thank you. Ethan just nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude. He went outside to check on the stock one last time before bed, giving her space to arrange her few belongings on the new bunk. The night was clear and cold, stars scattered across the sky like thrown diamonds. He stood in the yard for a long time, listening to the sounds of his ranch, cattle settling for the night, wind in the grass, the distant call of a coyote. Simple sounds, honest sounds, the sounds of a life he'd built to replace everything he'd lost. But tonight, for the first time in 6 years, there was another sound added to the mix. From inside the cabin came the soft humming of a woman arranging her home, making space in his life whether he was ready for it or not. Ethan wasn't a man who believed in fate or divine intervention. Life was what you made of it through hard work and harder choices. But standing there under the Montana stars, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that the woman Hutchins had dumped on his doorstep might be more than just a temporary inconvenience. Whether that was a blessing or a curse, only time would tell. He went back inside, barred the door, and settled into his bed. Across the cabin, Eliza was already under her blankets, her back to him, breathing steady and even. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting just enough light to see by. "Good night, Mr. Cole," she said quietly. "Ethan," he heard himself say. "If you're staying, you might as well call me Ethan." There was a pause. Then, so softly, he almost missed it. "Good night, Ethan." He closed his eyes and waited for sleep, for the dreams that would come. But tonight, for reasons he didn't fully understand, the weight on his chest felt slightly lighter. The cabin felt slightly less empty. The future felt slightly less like a sentence to be endured. It was just the first day of a week-long trial. But Ethan Cole was beginning to suspect that 1 week wouldn't be nearly enough to figure out what to do about Eliza Moore. And that terrified him more than any rustler ever could. The week that followed established a rhythm neither of them had anticipated. Ethan woke before dawn each morning to find Eliza already up, coffee brewing, preparing something that resembled an actual breakfast instead of the stale bread and jerky he'd grown accustomed to. She worked without complaint, transforming his bachelor cabin into something that felt almost civilized. The floor got swept daily. His shirts, which had been crusted with months of dirt and sweat, came back from the wash line clean and mended. The windows, which he'd never bothered to clean, suddenly let in enough light to make the cabin feel twice its actual size. But it was the quiet competence that struck him most. Eliza didn't ask permission for every small decision. She simply saw what needed doing and did it. When she discovered his firewood supply was poorly stacked and at risk of rot, she restacked the entire pile without mentioning it. When a hinge on the barn door broke, he came back from checking cattle to find she'd already replaced it with one she'd fashioned from scrap metal and wire. "Where'd you learn to do that?" he'd asked, examining her handiwork. "Necessity?" she'd replied simply. "You'd be surprised what you can figure out when the alternative is going without." By the 4th day, Ethan had stopped watching her with suspicion and started watching her with something closer to respect. By the 5th day, he'd caught himself looking forward to returning to the cabin just to see what small improvement she'd made. By the 6th day, he realized the week was almost over and he had no idea what he was going to do about that. The answer came from an unexpected direction. Ethan was in the barn repairing tack when he heard horses approaching. Multiple horses, moving fast. His hand went to his Colt automatically, a reflex so ingrained he barely noticed it anymore. He stepped to the barn door and felt his jaw tighten when he recognized the riders. Mayor Hutchins led the group, his substantial belly testing the patience of his poor gelding. Behind him rode three other men Ethan recognized from town: Samuel Pierce, who owned the general store, Dutch Morrison, the blacksmith, and bringing up the rear, looking deeply uncomfortable, was Thomas Graves. Ethan's hand stayed on his gun. They pulled up in his yard, and Hutchins dismounted with a grunt of effort. "Cole, need a word with you." "Then speak it and get off my land." Now that's not very hospitable. Hutchins pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and mopped his face, though the morning was cool. "We've come about the girl. Miss Moore has a name. Use it." "Fine. We've come about Miss Moore." Hutchins glanced at the cabin where Eliza had appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "She been any trouble?" "No." "Good, good. That's what we hope to hear." Hutchins tucked his handkerchief away. "Thing is, Cole, we've been discussing the situation in town, and we feel it might be best if Miss Moore moved on, perhaps took the stage to Helena, or maybe Virginia City, somewhere with more opportunities for a woman in her particular circumstances." Ethan felt ice forming in his gut. Her circumstances being that she was lied to and humiliated by one of your upstanding citizens? Thomas Graves flinched but said nothing. He was a handsome man, Ethan noted with distaste, the kind of clean-cut, well-groomed appearance that probably made trusting him easy, the kind of man who could smile while stabbing you in the back. "Now that's not fair," Pierce interjected. "There's been no proof of Mr. Graves's wrongdoing, just accusations from a woman who what?" Ethan's voice dropped to that dangerous quiet. "Finish that sentence, Pierce. I'm real curious to hear how you plan to defame a woman's character while standing in my yard." Pierce's mouth snapped shut. Hutchins raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Nobody's defaming anyone. We're simply suggesting that Miss Moore might be happier elsewhere. This ranch is isolated, harsh. She's a young woman who deserves a chance at a proper life. And you're so concerned about her welfare that you came all the way out here to help." Ethan's tone made it clear what he thought of their concern. Nothing to do with the fact that having her in the territory is an embarrassment to Graves there, or that your town's reputation might suffer if people start asking too many questions about how a woman got treated so poorly. "That's not," Hutchins sputtered. "That's exactly what this is." Ethan stepped forward, and all four men instinctively backed up. "You want her gone because she's inconvenient, because her presence reminds everyone that maybe your precious community isn't as righteous as you like to think." "She's filled your head with lies," Graves said suddenly, his voice tight. "Whatever she's told you about me, it's not true. I never promised her anything. She came to Bitter Creek with delusions, and when I tried to let her down gently, she—" "You got any proof of that?" Ethan interrupted. "I don't need proof. My word. Your word means nothing to me. I've known men like you my whole life, dress them up in fine clothes and teach them to smile, but underneath they're the same as the cowards who shot at us from behind trees during the war, all polish and no spine." Graves's face went red. "How dare you?" "I dare because this is my land and you're not welcome on it." Ethan's hand stayed on his Colt. "Now, you've got exactly 1 minute to state your actual business before I start treating you like the trespassers you are." Hutchins pulled an envelope from his coat. "We've taken up a collection, $50, enough for stage fare and a stake somewhere new. We're willing to give it to Miss Moore in exchange for her immediate departure from the territory. You're trying to buy her silence. We're trying to help her start fresh." Ethan looked past them to where Eliza still stood in the doorway. Her face was pale but composed, her hands twisted in her apron. Their eyes met, and he saw something there that made his decision easier than it should have been. "She stays," he said flatly. "Cole, be reasonable. She stays. She's got work here, a place to sleep, and nobody bothering her with their sanctimonious concern. That's more than your town ever gave her." "You can't be serious," Pierce said. "A man and a woman, unmarried, living together in isolation, the scandal alone. I don't give a damn about scandal. And anyone who wants to make something of our living arrangements can come discuss it with me personally." He patted his Colt. "I'm always happy to have those conversations." Hutchins looked genuinely distressed now. "You're making a mistake. This girl is trouble, Cole. She's unstable, vindictive. She's none of those things. What she is honest about what happened to her. And that makes you uncomfortable because it means admitting one of your own is a lying bastard who destroyed a woman's life for entertainment. That's slander, Graves hissed. Then sue me. But while you're filing your complaint in court, maybe bring those forged letters you claim she wrote. I'd love to see a judge examine them. Graves went quiet, confirming what Ethan had already suspected. There were no letters, no evidence, just a powerful man's word against a friendless woman's truth. Hutchins sighed, a sound of genuine frustration. I tried to help you, Cole. Tried to give you someone to look after the place. But if you insist on being stubborn about this, I insist on making my own decisions about my own property and who works it. Now get off my land before I lose what's left of my patience. The four men exchanged glances. Morrison, who'd been silent throughout, shook his head slightly. Whether in disgust at Ethan or his companions, it was hard to tell. They mounted up, Hutchins stuffing the envelope back in his coat with obvious annoyance. You'll regret this, Graves said, trying for menace and achieving only petulance. I regret having to breathe the same air as you, but we don't always get what we want. They rode off, kicking up dust. Ethan watched until they disappeared over the ridge, then turned to find Eliza had come down from the cabin and was standing a few feet away. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. Yes, I did. They offered money, enough to get me far from here, to start over somewhere nobody knows my story. You want to take it? I'll ride after them, get you that envelope. Eliza shook her head slowly. No, I'm tired of running, tired of being shuffled around like an inconvenient problem. She met his eyes. But I need to know. Why did you defend me? You barely know me. For all you know, everything they said could be true. Ethan considered his answer carefully. During the war, I saw men lie about all kinds of things. Saw officers claim credit for victories won by common soldiers. Saw politicians blame defeats on dead men who couldn't defend themselves. Got so I could spot a liar pretty quick. It's in the eyes, the way they can't quite hold your gaze when they're spinning their stories. And Graves looked away every time he spoke about you. Hutchins kept touching his face. Another tell. They were lying, or at least they believed they were covering for a lie. You, on the other hand, look people straight in the eye when you talk, even when the truth makes you vulnerable. That tells me what I need to know. You trust me based on instinct? I trust evidence, and the evidence is that you've worked hard, kept your word, and caused me no trouble beyond making my coffee too strong. The corner of his mouth twitched. Though I suppose that last one could be considered a crime in some jurisdictions. Eliza surprised him by laughing, not the bitter, cynical sound he'd heard before, but genuine amusement. It transformed her face, made her look younger, less burdened. I'll try to make it weaker, she said. Don't you dare. They stood there in the yard, an awkward silence settling between them. Finally, Eliza said, The week's up tomorrow. I know. Do you want me to go? Ethan looked at his cabin, at the clean windows, the swept porch, the garden plot Eliza had started clearing near the south wall. He thought about going back to cold breakfasts and dirty floors and the crushing weight of absolute solitude. No, he said. I want you to stay, if you're willing. What are the terms? Same as before. Room and board, plus I'll pay you $10 a month. It's not much, but it's what I can afford and still keep the ranch running. That's more than fair. Eliza held out her hand, businesslike. I accept. Ethan shook her hand, noting the calluses that had formed over the past week, the strength in her grip. This was not a woman who'd break easily. Good, he said. Then it's settled. But as he went back to his work in the barn, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that nothing was settled at all. If anything, by choosing to keep Eliza on, by defending her against the town, he'd just made both their lives considerably more complicated. Time would tell whether that was the right choice or his biggest mistake since coming to Montana. The days that followed took on a new quality. With the trial period over and the understanding that Eliza was staying, something subtle shifted in their dynamic. They fell into a deeper rhythm, one built on mutual respect and careful boundaries that neither was quite ready to cross. Ethan taught her to shoot, spending an afternoon setting up targets and showing her proper stance, breathing, trigger control. She proved to be a decent shot once she got over her tendency to flinch. Better, he said, after she hit 3 cans in a row. You won't win any competitions, but you could defend yourself if needed. Is that likely to be necessary? Out here? Always possible. Wildlife, drifters, men like those rustlers. He reloaded her rifle. Besides, every person on a ranch should know how to handle a weapon. It's just practical. Eliza also insisted on learning to rope, though she was terrible at it. Ethan watched her attempt to lasso a fence post for the better part of an hour, missing every single throw. Maybe roping isn't your calling, he suggested diplomatically. I'll get it eventually. Maybe focus on the things you're good at first, like cooking and fixing things, and basically everything else. She threw the rope at him, which he caught easily. Are you mocking me, Mr. Cole? Ethan, he reminded her, and yes, a little, but respectfully. The banter came easier now. Ethan found himself talking more, sharing stories from before the war that he'd thought were buried too deep to resurrect. Eliza, in turn, spoke about her childhood in Illinois, her father's determination to educate her despite social expectations, her mother's quiet strength. She died of consumption, Eliza said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Took 2 years. Toward the end, she made me promise I'd never let circumstances define me, that I'd always fight for my own life, my own choices. Sounds like a wise woman. She was. Though I wonder what she'd think of how I've fought, traveling west on a promise, ending up disgraced, working as a housekeeper in the middle of nowhere. I think she'd be proud you're still fighting, still here. That's more than a lot of people can say. Eliza looked at him, something soft in her expression. You're kinder than you pretend to be. Don't spread that around. I've got a reputation to maintain. But the peaceful rhythm couldn't last forever. Trouble came again on a cold morning 2 weeks after Hutchins' visit. Ethan was checking the cattle in the north pasture when he spotted something that made his blood run cold. 5 head were down, dead for at least a day based on the bloating. He dismounted and examined them carefully, looking for wounds, signs of disease, anything that would explain their deaths. That's when he saw the foam at their mouths and smelled the bitter almond scent, poison. Someone had poisoned his water source. He rode back to the cabin at a gallop, his mind racing. This wasn't random. This was deliberate, targeted, and he had a pretty good idea who was behind it. Eliza met him at the door, alarm on her face. What's wrong? Don't drink the well water. Don't let the stock near the main creek. Someone's poisoned it. Her hand went to her mouth. The same thing that happened before? The dispute you mentioned? Similar, but this time I know who's responsible. He was already moving, gathering supplies. I need to ride to town. This ends today. Ethan, wait. If you go in angry, if you do something you can't take back, they killed my cattle, Eliza. They poisoned my land. What exactly do you expect me to do? Ask them politely to stop? I expect you to be smart about this. Going in with your gun drawn will only prove whatever they want people to believe about you, that you're violent, unstable, dangerous. I am dangerous, especially to men who come after what's mine. Then be dangerous intelligently. She grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her. Get the sheriff involved. Document what happened. Build a case they can't deny. Don't give them the satisfaction of turning this into something they can use against you. Ethan wanted to argue. Every instinct he had screamed for immediate confrontation, for riding into town and putting his Colt in Thomas Graves's face until the man confessed. But Eliza's logic cut through the red haze of his anger. Fine, he said through gritted teeth. We'll do it your way. But if the law won't handle this, then we'll discuss other options. Together. The word together stopped him cold. He looked at Eliza, really looked at her, and saw fierce determination mixed with genuine concern. Not just for him, but for them both. She'd attached her fate to his, and now his problems were hers too. Together, he agreed finally. They rode to Bitter Creek side by side, Ethan leading one of the dead cattle on a travois he'd rigged to judge. It was gruesome, but it was evidence. Sheriff Barnes met them at his office, took one look at the deceased animal, and swore creatively. Poison again? Barnes asked, though he clearly already knew the answer. Strychnine by the smell. Someone contaminated my main creek, killed 5 head so far. Could be more. Barnes was an honest man as far as frontier lawmen went, which meant he was practical about justice but not immune to political pressure. He examined the cattle, took Ethan's statement, and promised to investigate. "But Cole," he added, "you need to understand my position. I can't go accusing prominent citizens without solid proof." "The proof is dead in front of you." "Proof of poisoning? Yes. Proof of who did it? That's harder." He rubbed his face tiredly. "Give me 3 days. Let me ask questions, check some things. If I find evidence pointing to a specific person, I'll act on it." "And if you don't?" "Then I'd suggest you be very careful about your accusations." Barnes glanced at Eliza. "Miss Moore, you're still at Cole's ranch?" "I work there, yes." "That's caused some talk in town." "People always find something to talk about," she replied evenly. "Usually because their own lives are too boring to sustain interest." Despite the tension, Barnes cracked a smile. "Fair point. Just be careful, both of you. There are folks who'd like to see this situation escalate, and I'd prefer to keep the peace if possible." They left the sheriff's office and walked down Bitter Creek's main street. Ethan could feel eyes on them from every window and doorway. The sight of him and Eliza together, clearly united in purpose, was causing exactly the kind of scandal Pierce had predicted. Ethan found he didn't care even a little bit. They were passing the general store when Thomas Graves stepped out, blocking their path. He looked worse than the last time Ethan had seen him, dark circles under his eyes, a nervous energy about him that suggested sleepless nights. "Cole," Graves said. "Miss Moore, I was hoping to run into you." "Then you're in luck," Ethan replied coldly. "Say what you need to say and get out of my way." "I wanted to apologize." The words came out rushed, rehearsed. "I've done some reflecting, and I realize my behavior toward Miss Moore was inappropriate. I led her to believe things that weren't true, and for that, I'm sorry." Eliza went very still beside Ethan. "You're apologizing now? After 3 months of calling me delusional and unstable? After destroying any chance I had of making a life in this town? I was protecting my family. Surely you can understand." "I understand that you're a coward," she said, her voice steady despite the anger burning in her eyes. "A coward and a liar. And this apology means nothing because it's not born of remorse. It's born of fear. You're afraid Sheriff Barnes is going to find evidence of what you've done." Graves's mask of contrition slipped. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The poisoned water, the dead cattle. You think I don't know it was you?" Ethan stepped forward. "You wanted to drive me off my land, make Eliza's position untenable so she'd have to leave. Then whatever guilt you were carrying could leave with her." "That's insane. I would never—" "You got anyone who can vouch for your whereabouts 2 nights ago?" Ethan asked. "Anyone who can swear you were home with your wife and not sneaking around my property in the dark?" Graves's face went pale, then red. "You can't prove anything." "Maybe not yet, but Sheriff Barnes is asking questions, and men like you always make mistakes. You're too arrogant to be careful, too entitled to think consequences apply to you." Ethan's voice dropped. "And when he finds the proof, because he will find it, I'm going to be there to watch you answer for what you've done." "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise." They left Graves standing in the street, fury and fear warring on his face. As they rode back to the ranch, Eliza was quiet, processing everything that had happened. "Do you really think Barnes will find proof?" she asked finally. "If he looks hard enough. Men like Graves think they're smarter than everyone else, but they're usually just better connected. And connections only protect you until they don't. What if he doesn't find anything? What if Graves is protected by those connections? Then we handle it ourselves." "Meaning," Ethan looked at her, his expression grim, "meaning I've survived a war, betrayal, and 6 years of isolation. Thomas Graves is a town merchant playing at intimidation. If he wants a real fight, I'll give him one he'll regret." Eliza reached over and touched his arm. "I don't want you to compromise yourself for my sake. I've caused you enough trouble already." "You haven't caused me any trouble. Graves did. Hutchins did. The whole damn town did by treating you like you were disposable." He covered her hand with his briefly, then pulled away, suddenly aware of the intimacy of the gesture. "Besides, nobody poisons my land and gets away with it. This stopped being just about you the moment they killed my cattle." They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a comfortable silence now. united in purpose, if nothing else. The 3 days Barnes had requested stretched into 5, then a week. During that time, Ethan had to shoot 2 more cattle that showed signs of poisoning, and he spent long hours diverting water from a clean source higher up in the mountains. It was exhausting, expensive work that set back all his other projects. Eliza helped without being asked, hauling water, tending stock, working until her hands bled despite the gloves. She never complained, never suggested this was more than she'd bargained for. If anything, she seemed energized by having a clear purpose, a tangible problem to solve. One evening, as they sat exhausted on the porch after a particularly grueling day, Eliza said, "Can I ask you something personal?" Ethan tensed but nodded. "Go ahead." "Why did you really let me stay? And don't say it's just because you believe my story about graves. There's more to it than that." He was quiet for a long moment, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "After Sarah died," he said finally, "I spent a lot of time thinking about what I could have done differently. If I hadn't gone to war, if I'd stayed on the farm, if I'd been there when she got sick. All the choices that led to her grave. You couldn't have known. No, I couldn't, but that doesn't stop the questions." He leaned back against the porch post. "Eventually I realized I was asking the wrong thing. The question wasn't what I could have done differently in the past. It was what I was going to do differently going forward. And I decided that if I ever got another chance to help someone, to make a choice that mattered, I wasn't going to let fear or selfishness or caution stop me." He looked at her. "You needed help. I could provide it. The decision was that simple." "Nothing about this is simple." "No," he agreed. "But it's right, and sometimes that's enough." Eliza was quiet for a moment, then said, "I think your Sarah would be proud of the man you've become. Even with all the anger and isolation, you're still trying to do right by people. That counts for something." Ethan felt something loosen in his chest, some knot of guilt and grief that had been there so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to be without it. He didn't trust himself to speak, so he just nodded. They sat together in the gathering darkness, 2 damaged people finding unexpected solace in shared silence, neither quite ready to admit that something deeper than convenience or charity was taking root between them. The storm that hit 3 weeks later came without warning, rolling down from the mountains like the wrath of nature itself. Ethan had seen bad weather before, blizzards that buried entire homesteads, tornadoes that carved paths of destruction across the plains. But this was different. This was Montana showing what it could do when it truly wanted to remind humans how small they were. The morning had started deceptively calm. Ethan woke to find Eliza already at the stove, as usual, but something in her posture made him pause. "What's wrong?" he asked. She pointed to the window. "Look at the sky." The horizon to the west was a wall of black clouds, roiling and churning like something alive. Lightning flickered inside them, not striking down but moving horizontally through the mass, illuminating it from within. The air had that heavy electric quality that made every hair stand on end. "That's going to be bad," Ethan said quietly. "How bad?" "Bad enough that we need to secure everything we can and pray it passes quickly." He was already pulling on his boots, his mind racing through everything that needed doing. "The cattle in the north pasture need to be moved to lower ground. The barn doors need reinforcing. We should bring extra water inside in case the well gets contaminated again." "What can I do?" "Help me with the stock first. Everything else can wait." They worked with frantic efficiency for the next 2 hours. The cattle were skittish, sensing the coming storm, and moving them was like trying to herd water. Ethan rode Judge hard, pushing the animals toward the relative safety of the canyon where they'd have some protection from wind. Eliza followed on Clementine, blocking the stragglers from breaking away. By the time they got the last of the herd settled, the wind had picked up to a howl. It tore at their clothes, threw dust and debris into their faces, made the horses dance nervously beneath them. "Get back to the cabin," Ethan shouted over the roar. "I need to check the canyon one more time, make sure they're all accounted for." "I'm coming with you." "No, it's too dangerous." "Then it's too dangerous for you too." Eliza's hair had come loose from its bun and whipped around her face. "We do this together or not at all?" There was no time to argue. The first drops of rain were starting to fall, huge and cold as ice. Ethan spurred Judge toward the canyon with Eliza right behind him. The cattle had clustered together in the lee of the rock face, bawling their distress. He did a quick count. They were all there, or close enough. One or two might have wandered off, but searching for them in this weather would be suicide. That's when he heard it, a sound that made his blood freeze despite years of facing death in all its forms. A deep, thunderous rumble that wasn't thunder at all. "Flash flood," he breathed, then louder. "Flash flood! Get out of the canyon now!" He wheeled Judge around and saw Eliza's eyes go wide with understanding. They both kicked their horses into a gallop, racing back the way they'd come. Behind them, the rumble grew louder, joined by the crash of water hitting rock, the grinding of boulders being torn loose and swept downstream. The canyon was a natural drainage for the mountain runoff, and somewhere upstream, hours of rain had finally overwhelmed whatever natural dams and diversions normally controlled the flow. Now all that water was coming down in a wall of destruction that would crush anything in its path. Ethan could see the mouth of the canyon ahead. 30 yards, 20. If they could just reach open ground, they'd be safe. The flood would sweep through the canyon and disperse across the valley floor, losing its killing force. 15 yards. Judge's hooves found purchase on the rocky ground, muscles bunching and releasing with desperate speed. Beside him, Clementine matched the pace. Eliza crouched low over her neck, urging the mare onward. 10 yards. The sound behind them was deafening now, like a train bearing down. Ethan risked a glance back and saw the water cresting over the far bend of the canyon, a churning mass of brown foam studded with debris, moving faster than any horse could run. 5 yards. They burst from the canyon mouth onto open ground just as the flood hit. The sheer force of it created a backdraft of wind and spray that knocked both horses sideways. Judge stumbled, went down on one knee, and Ethan was thrown clear. He hit the ground hard, felt something in his ribs crack, and rolled to avoid Judge's thrashing hooves. Through the rain and spray, he saw Clementine lose her footing on the muddy slope. The mare's eyes rolled white with terror as she slid backward, back toward the killing water. Eliza kicked free of the stirrups and jumped, hitting the ground and rolling. She came up running, reaching for safety, but the slope was too slick, and she wasn't fast enough. The edge of the flood caught her legs and swept them out from under her. Ethan was moving before conscious thought, ignoring the fire in his ribs, lunging forward. His hand closed on her wrist just as the current tried to claim her. The force of the water was incredible, trying to tear her from his grasp. He dug his heels into the mud, his other hand scrabbling for purchase on anything solid. His fingers found a root, half exposed by erosion. He wrapped his hand around it and held on while the flood tried to take them both. Eliza's weight pulled at his shoulder, threatening to dislocate it. She was screaming something he couldn't hear over the roar, her free hand clawing at the slippery ground. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, they hung there. Ethan anchored to the root, Eliza to Ethan, the flood to Eliza. His shoulder felt like it was tearing apart. His ribs sent spikes of agony through his chest with every breath. The root was starting to give way, pulling loose from the saturated earth. Then Judge was there, somehow back on his feet despite his own terror. The roan planted himself above Ethan and lowered his head, and Ethan understood. He released the root and grabbed Judge's bridle with his free hand. The horse backed up, using his weight and strength to pull them both away from the flood's grasp. Inch by inch, they came clear of the water. Ethan hauled Eliza up the slope until they were both on solid ground, then collapsed on his back, staring up at the storm-dark sky while rain hammered his face. His ribs screamed, his shoulder felt like it was on fire. But they were alive. Eliza crawled over to him, her hair plastered to her face, her dress torn and muddy. "Are you hurt?" "Ribs, maybe broken." "You?" "Bruised, terrified, but whole." She touched his chest gently, feeling for the damage. Even through the pain, Ethan was aware of her hands on him, the concern in her eyes. "We need to get you back to the cabin. The cattle are gone or scattered. We'll find them later. Right now, you're bleeding and possibly dying, so we're going back." Her tone left no room for argument. Getting Ethan into the saddle was an exercise in controlled agony. Every movement felt like knives sliding between his ribs. Eliza mounted behind him on Judge, her arms around his waist to keep him upright. Clementine was gone, swept away by the flood or fled in panic. There was no way to know. The ride back to the cabin took forever. The storm had reached its full fury now, rain falling so hard it was difficult to breathe. Lightning struck close enough to feel the air crackle, followed immediately by thunder that shook the ground. Ethan faded in and out of consciousness, aware only of pain and Eliza's arms holding him steady. When they finally reached the cabin, she half carried him inside and lowered him onto his bed. He tried to protest. He was covered in mud and blood, would ruin the blankets. But she shushed him with unexpected fierceness. "I don't care about the damn blankets, Ethan. Hold still." She built up the fire until the cabin was almost too warm, then began the process of assessing his injuries. His shirt had to be cut away. The fabric was stuck to his skin with drying blood from a gash on his shoulder he didn't remember getting. When she touched his ribs, even gently, he sucked in a breath through clenched teeth. "Broken?" he managed. "At least one, maybe two. I need to wrap them, but it's going to hurt." She was already tearing a sheet into strips, her movements practiced and sure. "My father broke his ribs twice. I learned how to do this from watching the doctor." "Lucky me." "Lucky you're still breathing." Her hands shook slightly as she worked, betraying the fear she was keeping from her voice. "When I saw you get thrown, when I felt the water take me, I thought, don't." Ethan caught her hand with his uninjured one. "Don't think about what might have happened. We're here, we're alive, that's enough. You almost died saving me. And you almost died because I insisted on checking the damn cattle." He tried to sit up to make the wrapping easier and immediately regretted it. "Call it even." Eliza bound his ribs with competent efficiency, tight enough to provide support, but not so tight he couldn't breathe. When she finished, she cleaned and bandaged the gash on his shoulder, then sat back to survey her work. "You need rest. Real rest. Not your version where you sleep for 4 hours and then decide you're fine." "Can't. Need to check the stock, see what's left. Need to assess damage to the ranch, the fences." "Ethan Cole, you listen to me." Eliza's voice cut through his protests like a blade. "You are in no condition to do anything except lie in that bed and heal. The ranch will still be there tomorrow. The cattle that survived will still be scattered tomorrow. But if you don't rest, if you push yourself and that rib punctures a lung or you collapse from exhaustion, then none of it matters because you'll be dead." The raw emotion in her voice stopped him cold. She was right, of course. He could feel his body shutting down, the adrenaline that had kept him moving finally depleted, but admitting weakness, accepting help. These were skills he deliberately unlearned over the past 6 years. "I don't know how to just lie here," he admitted quietly. "Don't know how to let someone else handle things." "Then learn." She pulled a blanket over him, her touch gentle. "You've been alone so long you've forgotten that having someone to depend on isn't weakness. It's just human." Ethan wanted to argue, but the exhaustion was winning. His eyes kept trying to close despite his best efforts. "What about you? You need to change, get warm." "I'll take care of myself after I know you're settled. Now sleep." He tried to fight it, but his body had other ideas. The last thing he was aware of was Eliza sitting beside the bed, her hand resting lightly on his arm, keeping watch. When he woke, it was dark, and the storm had passed. The cabin was quiet, except for the crackle of the fire and Eliza's soft breathing. She'd fallen asleep in the chair beside his bed, still in her ruined dress, a blanket pulled around her shoulders. In the firelight, her face looked younger, less guarded, peaceful. Ethan tried to shift position and immediately regretted it. The pain in his ribs flared hot and sharp, stealing his breath. He must have made a sound because Eliza's eyes opened immediately. "Don't move," she said, fully alert. "Your ribs need time to knit." "What time is it?" "Past midnight. You've been asleep for about 6 hours." "You should be in your own bed." "I was worried about fever. Head injuries can be tricky." She reached over and pressed her hand to his forehead. "You feel cool enough? How's the pain?" "Manageable." "That means terrible. I'll make willow bark tea." She moved to the stove and Ethan watched her work. There was something different about her tonight. A confidence, a sureness that hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had always been there and he was only now seeing it clearly. "Eliza," he said. "Thank you for pulling me out for this." He gestured vaguely at the bandages, the cabin, everything. She brought him the tea, helped him sit up enough to drink without choking. The bitter liquid was warm and helped dull the edges of the pain. "You don't need to thank me," she said, settling back into the chair. "You saved my life today. Multiple times, if we're counting. This is just returning the favor. It's more than that. You could have left me to die, taken judge, ridden away, started somewhere new with no one to know your past. Is that what you think of me? That I'd abandon you?" "I don't know what to think anymore." The words came out more honest than he intended. "A few weeks ago, you were a stranger. Now you're—" He trailed off, unsure how to finish. "Now I'm what?" Ethan met her eyes in the firelight. "Now you're the person I think about when I wake up. The one I look for when I ride in from the range. The reason this cabin doesn't feel like a prison anymore." Eliza went very still. "Ethan, I know it's not what either of us planned. I know you came here out of desperation, and I took you in out of, hell, I don't even know anymore. Stubbornness, maybe, or loneliness. But somewhere between then and now, something changed. You're injured, exhausted. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying that when I saw that water take you, when I felt you slipping from my grip, the only thought in my head was that I couldn't lose you. Not like I lost Sarah. Not like I lost everything else." He reached for her hand and she let him take it. "I'm saying that you matter to me, Eliza Moore. More than I wanted you to. More than is probably wise." Tears welled in Eliza's eyes, catching the firelight. "You can't say things like that. You can't make me hope for something that can't be." "Why can't it be?" "Because I'm ruined, remember? Damaged. No decent man would want me, that's what they say in town. And even if that wasn't true, even if you could look past my history, I'm not the woman you lost. I can't replace Sarah." "I'm not asking you to replace anyone." Ethan squeezed her hand gently. "I'm not looking for a ghost or a substitute. I'm looking at you, the woman who walked into my cabin with nothing but pride and determination. The woman who learned to shoot and rope and mend fence without complaining. The woman who just spent 6 hours watching over me to make sure I didn't die in my sleep." "Stop," she whispered. "Please stop." "Why? Because the truth is too hard to hear? Because you've convinced yourself you don't deserve anything good?" He pulled her hand to his chest, pressed it over his bandaged ribs where his heart beat beneath. "I've spent 6 years believing the same thing about myself. That happiness died with Sarah. That all I deserved was isolation and work and slow decay. But you changed that. You walked in and reminded me that being alive means more than just breathing." "I don't know how to do this," Eliza said, tears spilling over now. "I don't know how to trust that this is real and not just another lie that will destroy me." "I can't promise it won't hurt. Life hurts, that's just the nature of things. But I can promise I won't lie to you, won't betray you, won't send you away because other people think you're inconvenient." He pulled her closer with his good arm. "I'm asking you to stay, Eliza. Not as hired help, not as a housekeeper, but as my partner, as someone who matters. You're saying this because you almost died, because emotion is running high and everything feels more intense than it really is. Maybe, or maybe almost dying just made me brave enough to admit what I've been feeling for weeks." He touched her face, wiping away tears with his thumb. "Either way, the truth doesn't change. You've become important to me. And if you feel even a fraction of the same—" She kissed him before he could finish, leaning down carefully to avoid his injuries. It was gentle and fierce at the same time, tasting of salt from her tears, and something deeper, more desperate. When she pulled back, her eyes were still wet, but there was something else there now. Hope, fragile and new. "I'm terrified," she whispered against his lips. "Me too." "What if we're making a mistake?" "Then we make it together." He kissed her again, softer this time. "I'm done being alone, Eliza, done pretending I don't need anyone. If you'll have me, broken ribs, bad dreams, violent past, and all, I'm yours." "That's the worst marriage proposal I've ever heard," she said, but she was smiling through her tears. "I wasn't proposing, not yet." He tried to sit up straighter and winced. "When I propose, I'll do it properly. On one knee, with a ring. Probably still covered in mud because that seems to be my natural state, but at least I'll make the effort." Eliza laughed, the sound breaking some final barrier between them. You're impossible. And you're bossy, stubborn, and entirely too good at making me feel things I thought were dead. Is that a compliment? It's a fact. He pulled her down beside him on the bed, ignoring the protest from his ribs. Now stop arguing and just stay with me tonight. I don't want to be alone, and I don't think you do either. She settled against him carefully, her head on his good shoulder, her hand resting over his heart. Outside, the storm had given way to clear sky and distant stars. Inside, two people who'd been broken by life found themselves beginning to heal in each other's arms. "Ethan?" Eliza said softly. "Yeah?" "When you do propose, properly, on one knee, covered in mud, my answer will be yes." He smiled into her hair, feeling something warm and unfamiliar spreading through his chest. It took him a moment to recognize it as happiness. "Good to know," he murmured. "But first I have to not die from these broken ribs, so let's handle that before we start planning a wedding." "Deal." They drifted off together as the fire burned low, neither willing to let go of the other, both understanding that everything had changed tonight. The storm had taken much from them: cattle, property, nearly their lives. But it had also stripped away the final defenses they'd been hiding behind, leaving only the truth they'd both been too afraid to acknowledge. They needed each other, wanted each other, and maybe, just maybe, deserved a chance at something better than the loneliness they'd both accepted as their fate. When morning came, Ethan woke to find Eliza already up, tending the fire. She'd changed into dry clothes and pulled her hair back in its usual severe bun, but when she turned and saw him watching, her smile was different, softer, more open. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Like I got trampled by a herd of buffalo, but alive." He tried to sit up and managed it with only moderate agony. "I need to check the damage." "I already did. At first light." She brought him coffee, the good kind she knew he liked despite claiming it was too strong. "The canyon is destroyed, full of debris and dead cattle. I counted at least 15 head lost, maybe more buried under the mud and rocks. The north fence line is completely gone. The barn lost part of its roof. And we're going to need to dig a new well because the flood contaminated the old one." The litany of damage should have devastated him. A few weeks ago, it would have. But lying there, looking at this woman who'd gone out at dawn to assess the destruction so he wouldn't have to, Ethan felt something other than despair. "We'll rebuild," he said simply. "It's going to take months, cost more than you probably have. And that's assuming we can even salvage the ranch at this point." "We'll rebuild," he repeated. "Together, you and me, however long it takes." Eliza looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Together," she agreed. And in that moment, with his ranch half destroyed and his body broken, Ethan Cole felt richer than he ever had before. Because for the first time in 6 years, he had something worth fighting for beyond mere survival. He had a future, and someone to share it with. The work began the next day, though Ethan's body protested every movement. Eliza tried to keep him in bed, but after 3 hours of lying still while she hauled water and assessed supplies, he couldn't take it anymore. "I'm going to help," he announced, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. "You have broken ribs." "I have a broken ranch. The ribs will heal whether I'm lying down or standing up." "Ethan?" "Eliza." He met her eyes. "I appreciate the concern, but I can't just lie there while you do everything. Let me help. I'll be careful. I'll stop if it gets too bad, but I need to be useful." She studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "Fine. But you're not lifting anything heavy, you're not climbing anything, and the second I see you turn pale, you're going back to bed. Agreed?" "Agreed." They started with the most urgent tasks. The barn roof needed temporary patching before the next rain. The surviving cattle needed to be rounded up and counted. A new water source had to be established. Each job felt insurmountable on its own, but Eliza had a way of breaking them into manageable pieces. "Roof first," she said, surveying the damage. "Everything else requires the barn to be functional." Ethan watched her scramble up onto the damaged section with an ease that surprised him. She'd apparently spent the morning making a list of supplies and damage assessment, and now she worked with the focused determination of someone who'd decided there was no point in despair when action was available. "Hand me those boards," she called down. He did. ignoring the flare of pain in his ribs. They worked in tandem for the next several hours, Eliza doing the climbing and positioning while Ethan cut boards to size and passed up tools. It wasn't a perfect repair, they'd need proper materials from town eventually, but it would keep the weather out for now. By midday, they were both exhausted. Eliza climbed down from the roof, her face flushed from exertion, her hands rough with splinters. She looked at Ethan, and her expression immediately shifted to concern. "You're white as a sheet. Inside. Now." He wanted to argue, but the truth was he felt like he might pass out. The pain in his ribs had gone from manageable to excruciating somewhere around the 2-hour mark. He let Eliza guide him back to the cabin and into bed without protest. "You overdid it," she said, checking his bandages. There was fresh blood seeping through the one on his shoulder. Had to be done. "It could have waited one more day. You could have let yourself heal." But her tone was more worried than angry. She rebandaged the shoulder with gentle efficiency. "You're going to rest now, actually rest, and I'm going to ride to town for supplies." "No." The word came out sharper than he intended. "It's not safe. Graves is still out there, and after what happened, which is exactly why I need to go. We need materials, and we need to file a formal complaint with Sheriff Barnes about the flood. Someone needs to verify the damage was caused by poisoned water upstream, and if we don't act now, any evidence will be washed away or degraded." Ethan knew she was right, but the thought of her riding into town alone, facing the people who'd rejected her, possibly confronting Graves without backup, it made his chest tight with something beyond physical pain. "Then I'm coming with you." "You can barely stand." "I can sit a horse well enough." They stared at each other, both stubborn, both afraid, neither willing to back down. Finally, Eliza said, "What if we both go, but you stay mounted and let me handle the talking? You be there as support, but don't push yourself beyond what your body can handle." It was a compromise, and Ethan hated compromises, but it was also reasonable, which made it hard to argue against. "Fine," he conceded, "but we take the rifle, and at the first sign of trouble, you'll heroically ignore your injuries and start a gunfight." She raised an eyebrow. "Let's try to avoid that scenario." They saddled Judge. Clementine still hadn't been found, likely swept miles downstream or fled into the mountains, and rode double toward Bitter Creek. Ethan sat in front, Eliza behind him with her arms around his waist. The position was intimate, practical, and slightly awkward all at once. The town looked the same as always when they arrived, but Ethan felt the shift in atmosphere immediately. People stopped their conversations to stare. Women pulled their children closer. Men touched their hat brims to Ethan, but pointedly ignored Eliza. Sheriff Barnes was in his office, looking haggard and overworked. He glanced up when they entered, and his expression cycled through surprise, concern, and resignation in quick succession. "Cole, Miss Moore, heard about the flood. Bad business." "It was murder," Ethan said flatly. "Or attempted murder. That water was poisoned upstream deliberately, meant to kill my cattle and contaminate my land. When the storm hit, it turned poison into a weapon that nearly killed us both." Barnes rubbed his face tiredly. "You have proof of this?" "The dead cattle from before. The timing. The fact that my land has been targeted twice now in the exact same way." Ethan's voice was hard. "And I'm betting if you ride up to my creek and check the source, you'll find evidence someone tampered with it." "I'll send someone to look. But Cole, you have to understand." "Understand what? That Thomas Graves is protected because he's got money and connections? That attempted murder is acceptable as long as the victim is just some homesteader nobody cares about?" "That's not what I'm saying." Barnes stood, his own frustration evident. "I'm saying I need evidence that will hold up. Evidence that points to a specific person, not just vague accusations." "Then get that evidence," Eliza interjected quietly. "Ride to the ranch. Examine the flood damage. Check the creek source. Do your job, Sheriff, and stop making excuses for why you can't." Barnes looked at her, really looked at her, and something in his expression softened. "You're right. I'll do it. This afternoon I'll ride out personally and document everything." "Thank you," Eliza said. They left the sheriff's office and headed to the general store for supplies. Samuel Pierce was behind the counter, and his face went through a complex series of expressions when he saw them: surprise, discomfort, calculation. Cole, didn't expect to see you after what happened. Need supplies, lumber, nails, tar paper for the roof, food staples. Whatever you've got that can help rebuild. Pierce's eyes flicked to Eliza, then back to Ethan. That's going to be expensive. You good for it? I'm good for it. Because if you're not, I can't extend credit, store policy. Ethan pulled out the small leather pouch where he kept his savings, most of what remained after buying cattle and supplies for the year. He dumped it on the counter. The coins clinked heavily, making Pierce's eyes widen slightly. That cover it? Pierce counted the money quickly. Should cover the basics, yes. I'll have it loaded. We'll load it ourselves, Eliza interrupted. Just show us where the materials are. While they were loading supplies onto the wagon they'd borrowed from behind the store, Thomas Graves appeared. He looked worse than the last time Ethan had seen him, his clothes disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed and wild. This is your fault, Graves said without preamble, jabbing a finger at Eliza. Everything that's happened, the sheriff questioning me, my wife asking questions, the whole town looking at me like I'm some kind of monster. It's because of you and your lies. I never lied, Eliza said calmly, continuing to load boards. I told the truth, and you couldn't handle the consequences. Truth? You don't know what truth is. You came here with delusions, threw yourself at me, and when I rejected you... You rejected me? Eliza's laugh was sharp. You spent 8 months writing me love letters, 8 months making promises about our future together. You paid for my train ticket, Thomas. I have the receipt with your name on it, so please continue telling me how I deluded myself. Graves's face went purple. That's a lie. I never... You did. Eliza turned to face him fully now, and Ethan saw steel in her spine that made him proud despite the circumstances. And the only reason you're still denying it is because you know the moment you admit the truth, your entire life falls apart. Your wife leaves you. Your business suffers. The town sees you for what you really are, a coward who used a lonely woman for entertainment and then destroyed her to protect himself. I'll sue you for slander, Graves hissed. I'll take everything you have. I have nothing, Eliza said simply. You already took everything when you destroyed my reputation, so sue me, Thomas. Drag me into court, and let's see what a judge makes of those letters you claim don't exist. Let's put your word against mine in front of the law and see whose story holds up better. Graves opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came out. He looked like a fish drowning in air. That's what I thought, Eliza said. She turned back to the wagon. Ethan had been watching this exchange with growing admiration and carefully controlled rage. Now he stepped forward, putting himself between Graves and Eliza. You come near her again, he said quietly, and I'll forget about sheriffs and laws and the whole pretense of civilization. You understand me? You threatening me, Cole? I'm making a promise. Same one I made before. You hurt her. You answer to me. And unlike the law, I don't require proof or evidence or any of that bureaucratic nonsense. I just require certainty, and I'm real certain about what you did. Graves backed up a step despite himself. Whatever he saw in Ethan's eyes apparently convinced him that pushing further would be a mistake. This isn't over, he said, trying for bravado and achieving only desperation. You're right, Ethan agreed. It's not over, but it will be soon, one way or another. Graves retreated, nearly stumbling in his haste. Several townspeople had gathered to watch the confrontation, and their whispered conversations followed him down the street. Ethan saw Dutch Morrison among them, the big blacksmith's expression thoughtful. Morrison approached slowly, his massive hands held up in a gesture of peace. Cole, need to talk to you, private-like. Ethan's hand moved toward his gun, but Morrison shook his head. Not here to cause trouble. Got information you might want. They stepped aside while Eliza continued loading supplies. Morrison glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then spoke quietly. I've been doing some work for Graves the past few months, repairs to his store, some custom metal work. Last month he asked me to make something specific, a metal container with a tight seal, about the size of a flour tin. Paid me extra to keep it quiet. What kind of container? The kind you'd use to transport poison without it leaking or degrading. He didn't say that's what it was for, but I'm not stupid. And then when I heard about your cattle dying, about the poisoned water, Morrison shrugged his massive shoulders. I put it together. You willing to testify to this? Tell the sheriff? Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Graves has got friends, Cole. Powerful ones. I testify against him. I might find my business drying up, my family getting squeezed. It's not right, but it's reality. So you're telling me this why? Guilty conscience? Because what he did to Miss Moore was wrong. What he's doing to you is wrong. And because I've got a daughter about her age, and if some man treated her the way Graves treated that girl. Morrison's hands clenched into fists. Let's just say I understand why you're angry. But you won't help officially. I'll tell the sheriff what I know, but I can't promise more than that. Gotta look after my own first, you understand? Ethan did understand. He didn't like it, but he understood it. Survival often meant compromise, meant choosing your battles, meant protecting your own, even when doing right required sacrifice. Thanks for telling me, he said finally. It helps. Morrison nodded and walked away. Ethan returned to find Eliza had finished loading the wagon by herself. She was breathing hard from the effort, her face flushed. You should have waited for me, he said. You were busy. Besides, I'm stronger than I look. She climbed onto the wagon seat. Let's go home before I say something to someone else that makes our situation worse. The ride back was quiet. Ethan drove while Eliza sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. The sun was starting its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. That was brave, Ethan said finally. What you said to Graves. It was overdue. I've spent 3 months letting him control the narrative, letting his lies define me. I'm done with that. She looked at him. You showed me something, Ethan. You showed me that I don't have to accept other people's judgments, that I can fight back, that I'm worth fighting for. You are worth fighting for. So are you. They lapsed back into silence, but it was comfortable now, the kind of silence shared by people who didn't need words to communicate. When they reached the ranch, the damage looked less overwhelming than it had that morning. Maybe it was the light, or maybe it was perspective, but Ethan found he could look at the destroyed canyon and damaged barn without feeling crushed by it. They unloaded the wagon together, working until full dark. Eliza made supper from their new supplies, actual vegetables, fresh bread, even a bit of salt pork that hadn't been dried into jerky. They ate on the porch, watching stars emerge. Ethan, Eliza said softly, what happens next? After we rebuild, after this business with Graves is resolved, what happens to us? What do you want to happen? She paused, choosing her words carefully. I want to stay. Not just as your employee or even your partner in running this ranch. I want to build something here, with you. A real life, not just survival. That what you really want? Or what you think you should want because you've got nowhere else to go? Eliza turned to face him fully. I could go anywhere. I'm young, healthy, capable. I could take a stage to California, find work in a city, start over where nobody knows my past. I have choices, Ethan. Maybe not great ones, but they exist. Then why stay? Because somewhere between cooking your meals and mending your fences and nearly dying in that flood, I realized something. I don't want to run anymore. I don't want to be that woman who's always looking over her shoulder, always waiting for the next betrayal. I want to plant roots, and I want to plant them here, with you, in this harsh, beautiful place that doesn't care about scandal or reputation or any of that nonsense. Ethan felt something shift in his chest, that same warm feeling from the night before. You sure about that? Because once you commit to this life, to me, there's no going back to civilization. This ranch is remote, the work is brutal, and I'm not an easy man to live with. I'm not an easy woman to live with either. I'm stubborn and opinionated, and I have nightmares about betrayal. I talk in my sleep, and I make coffee too strong, and I've been told I'm too independent for a woman. She took his hand. But I think maybe that's exactly what you need. And maybe you, with your war demons and your isolation and your terrible communication skills, are exactly what I need too. That's not very romantic. I'm not looking for romance. I'm looking for truth, for partnership, for someone who sees me as I actually am and wants me anyway. She squeezed his hand. Are you that person, Ethan Cole? Can you be? He thought about his answer carefully, thought about Sarah and the guilt he'd carried, thought about the 6 years of deliberate isolation, the violence, the nightmares, thought about everything he'd been and everything he'd lost. Then he thought about Eliza, fierce, capable, damaged in the same ways he was damaged. He thought about how she'd stood up to Graves, how she'd worked herself to exhaustion rebuilding his ranch, how she'd sat beside his bed all night to make sure he didn't die. Yes, he said simply, I can be that person. I want to be that person. She smiled, and it lit up her whole face. Then ask me, properly this time. Ethan stood, wincing at the protest from his ribs, and lowered himself to one knee. It hurt like hell, but some things were worth the pain. He took her hand in both of his. Eliza Moore, I don't have a ring yet, and I'm definitely covered in mud, and this is probably the worst timing given that we're both exhausted and my ranch is half destroyed. But I know what I want, and I want you. Will you marry me? Will you take this broken man and his broken ranch and help me build something worth keeping? Tears were streaming down her face now, but she was laughing too. That's slightly better than your first attempt. Still not great, but I'll accept it. Is that a yes? That's a yes. She pulled him back to his feet, careful of his injuries. Now kiss me before you pass out from kneeling with broken ribs. He kissed her, and it felt like sealing a promise that went deeper than words. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Eliza pressed her forehead against his. We're probably crazy, she whispered. Definitely crazy. People are going to talk. Let them talk. It's going to be hard. Everything worth doing is hard. She laughed against his lips. When did you become optimistic? When you walked into my cabin and reminded me that being alive means more than just surviving. They stood there on the porch, holding each other under the Montana stars, two people who'd been discarded by the world finding unexpected salvation in each other. The ranch was still damaged, Graves was still a threat, and the future was uncertain. But for the first time in longer than either could remember, the future felt like something worth fighting for. The next morning, Sheriff Barnes arrived with 2 deputies and spent 3 hours examining the ranch. He documented the flood damage, took samples from the creek, counted the dead cattle. When he was finished, his expression was grim. You were right, Cole. Someone tampered with your water source. Found remnants of a metal container upstream, buried in mud but still visible. Also found footprints, horse tracks, evidence of recent activity. Graves? Can't say for certain yet. But combined with Morrison's testimony about the container and the pattern of harassment, Barnes sighed. I've got enough to bring him in for questioning, maybe enough to charge him if he cracks under pressure. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Even if I charge him, getting a conviction will be hard. He's got money for lawyers, friends in high places. This could drag on for months. I've got time, Ethan said, and I've got patience. What I don't have is any intention of letting this go. Barnes nodded slowly. Figured you'd say that. Just try to let the law handle it, Cole. I know you've got skills from the war, and I know you're angry, but vigilante justice only makes things worse. I'll let the law handle it, Ethan agreed, as long as the law actually handles it. After Barnes left, Ethan and Eliza returned to the work of rebuilding. Over the following weeks, they fell into a rhythm that felt right in ways neither had experienced before. They worked from dawn until dark, repairing fences, clearing debris, salvaging what cattle they could find. Slowly, painfully, the ranch began to heal. And so did they. Ethan's ribs knitted themselves back together. The nightmares that had plagued him for years started to fade, or at least lose some of their power. He found himself laughing more, talking more, letting down the walls he'd built so carefully. Eliza bloomed in the harsh Montana environment like a wildflower that had finally found the right soil. Her hands grew rougher, her skin darker from the sun, her body stronger from the work. But more than that, the brittleness that had defined her when she first arrived, that defensive armor built from betrayal and humiliation, began to soften into something more genuine. They talked about getting married properly, with a ceremony and witnesses, but kept putting it off. There was always more work to do, always another crisis to manage. But the delay didn't feel wrong somehow. They were already committed in every way that mattered. 2 months after the flood, Sheriff Barnes arrested Thomas Graves for attempted murder, criminal mischief, and destruction of property. The trial was set for the following spring. When news reached the ranch, Eliza surprised Ethan by crying. Not tears of vindication or joy, but something deeper, more complicated. "I thought I'd feel triumphant," she said as he held her. "I thought justice would feel good. But it doesn't. It feels necessary, important, but not good. Because none of this brings back the time I lost, the innocence I had before all this started. It doesn't undo the damage." "No," Ethan agreed, "but it stops him from doing it to someone else, and that has to count for something." She nodded against his chest. "It does count. You're right. It's just, I'm tired of being defined by what he did to me. Tired of my story being about betrayal and vindication. Then we write a new story, starting now, one where you're not the victim of Thomas Graves's cruelty, but the woman who built a life and a home in one of the harshest places in the territory. The woman who survived a flash flood and rebuilt a ranch from scratch. The woman who chose her own future instead of accepting what others decided for her." Eliza pulled back to look at him. "When did you get so wise?" "I'm not wise. I'm just done letting the past own the present." She kissed him, soft and lingering. "I love you, you know. I don't think I've said that out loud yet, but I do." "I love you too," Ethan said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "Now let's go celebrate properly." "How?" "I'm thinking we finally ride into town, walk into that church, and get married before something else tries to kill us or burn down the ranch." Eliza laughed, the sound bright and free. "That's the most romantic proposal I've ever heard." Third time's the charm. They rode to Bitter Creek the next day, walked into the small church, and asked the minister to perform the ceremony. There were no guests except Dutch Morrison and his wife, who happened to be there and agreed to serve as witnesses. No fancy dress, no reception, no celebration beyond a simple meal at the town's only restaurant. But when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, when Ethan kissed his bride in the dusty little church, he felt something he hadn't felt since before the war. Complete. They returned to the ranch as the sun set, Eliza riding beside him on a new mare they'd purchased with money from selling some salvaged equipment. The cabin waited for them, small and rough, but unmistakably home. "Mrs. Cole," Ethan said, testing the name. "I like the sound of that," Eliza replied. "Though I still think I should hyphenate. More Cole. Sounds more distinguished. You can call yourself whatever you want, long as you stay. I'm not going anywhere." She leaned over in her saddle to kiss him. "This is home now. You're home." And as they rode into their yard under the vast Montana sky, Ethan Cole realized that the lonely cowboy who'd lived in angry isolation was gone. In his place was a man with a wife, a future, and a reason to believe that tomorrow might actually be better than today. It wasn't the life he'd planned. It wasn't even the life he'd thought he wanted. But it was his, hard-won and honestly earned. And that made it perfect. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with a fury that tested everything they'd rebuilt. Ethan and Eliza worked frantically to prepare, knowing their first winter together would either prove the strength of what they'd built or expose fatal weaknesses in their hasty repairs. The new well held against the freezing temperatures. The patched barn roof kept the snow out. The cattle they'd managed to salvage huddled in the protected valleys, surviving on hay they'd cut and stored during the brief autumn. Every morning, Ethan woke before dawn to break ice in the water troughs, and every morning Eliza was already up, coffee brewing, planning the day's work. They moved through the frozen months as a single unit, anticipating each other's needs, communicating in the shorthand that develops between people who've chosen to depend on each other absolutely. The isolation that had once crushed Ethan now felt like protection. The cabin that had been a prison became a sanctuary. In late January, a letter arrived from Sheriff Barnes. Thomas Graves had accepted a plea agreement. Rather than face trial and almost certain conviction based on Morrison's testimony and the physical evidence, he'd confessed to poisoning the water source. He wouldn't serve jail time. His lawyers had been that good. But he was ordered to pay substantial restitution to Ethan for the lost cattle and damages. More importantly, he'd been publicly disgraced, his confession printed in the territorial newspaper. His wife had left him, taking the children. His business was failing as former customers found reasons to shop elsewhere. "He's destroyed," Eliza said quietly, reading the letter over Ethan's shoulder. "Everything he tried to protect by ruining me, he lost anyway." "You feel sorry for him?" "No, but I don't feel triumphant either, just tired of it all, ready to move past it completely." Ethan turned in his chair to face her. "Then we move past it. We take his money, use it to make this ranch better than it was before, and we never speak his name again. He doesn't get any more of our time or energy." "Agreed." She folded the letter and set it aside. "Besides, I have other things to think about now." Something in her tone made Ethan look at her more closely. There was a flush to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the cold, and her hand rested unconsciously on her stomach. "Eliza? I wasn't sure how to tell you. Wasn't sure if I should wait, or if there was some proper way to announce it, or—" She took a breath. "I'm pregnant, Ethan. About 3 months along, I think. I wanted to be certain before I said anything." For a moment, Ethan couldn't process the words. His mind went blank, then flooded with so many emotions at once that he couldn't separate them. Fear and joy and terror and wonder all crashed together. "A baby," he said stupidly. "A baby," she confirmed, watching his face carefully. "I know it's sooner than we planned. I know the timing is terrible with winter and the ranch still recovering and everything else, but—" He kissed her before she could finish, pulling her into his arms with desperate gentleness. When he pulled back, he realized his eyes were wet. "Don't apologize," he said roughly. "Don't you dare apologize for giving me something I never thought I'd have again." "You're happy?" "Happy doesn't begin to cover it." He placed his hand over hers on her stomach, marveling at the idea of life growing there. "Terrified, yes. Completely unprepared, absolutely. But happy in a way I didn't know was possible." Eliza's eyes filled with tears. "I was so worried you'd think it was too soon, that we weren't ready. We'll never be ready. Nobody's ever ready for this. But we'll figure it out together, same as we figured out everything else." He kissed her again, softer this time. "When?" "Late summer, I think. August, maybe early September." Ethan did the mental calculation. The baby had been conceived shortly after the flood, during those first tentative weeks when they'd stopped fighting what was growing between them. It felt right somehow, that new life had come from the moment they'd nearly lost everything. The pregnancy changed things in ways both subtle and profound. Ethan found himself watching Eliza with new eyes, seeing her strength but also her vulnerability. He became protective in ways that annoyed her and touched her in equal measure. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," she said one morning when he tried to stop her from hauling water. "I know that. You just need to let me do what I can while I can. I'll let you know when I need help, but treating me like an invalid isn't helping anyone." He backed off, though it went against every instinct, but he noticed she started accepting help more readily as winter progressed into spring. Her body changed in ways that fascinated and slightly terrified him. The swell of her belly became visible under her dresses, and he'd catch himself staring, amazed that his child was growing there. Spring brought the trial, though Graves's confession had effectively ended any real drama. Ethan and Eliza attended anyway, wanting to see it through to the end. The judge accepted the plea agreement, ordered the restitution paid, and delivered a scathing assessment of Graves's character that left the man visibly shaken. Outside the courthouse, Graves approached them one last time. He looked diminished, the polish and confidence stripped away to reveal something smaller and sadder underneath. "I just wanted to say," he began. "Don't," Eliza interrupted. "Don't apologize now. Don't explain. Don't make excuses. It's done. We're done. Live with what you've done and leave us alone." Graves nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, I am sorry. I was selfish and cruel, and I destroyed lives for no good reason. I know that now." "Good," Ethan said flatly. "Now go be sorry somewhere we never have to see you again." They walked away without looking back, and Ethan felt Eliza's hand squeeze his tightly. That chapter was closed. They could finally, truly move forward. The restitution money arrived in May, more than Ethan had expected. They used it to hire help for the summer, 2 ranch hands who could handle the heavy work while Eliza's pregnancy advanced. They bought new breeding stock to replace what had been lost. They expanded the barn and built a proper hen house. Slowly, methodically, they transformed the ranch from a place of survival into something that could actually thrive. One evening in early June, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Eliza said, "I've been thinking about names." "For the baby?" "No, for the ranch. We should give it a proper name. Something that means something to us." Ethan considered this. "What did you have in mind?" "Second Chance Ranch." She glanced at him. "Too sentimental?" "No," he said slowly. "It's perfect. Because that's what this place is. A second chance for both of us. A second chance at life, at happiness, at everything we thought we'd lost." Second Chance Ranch it is, then. They had a sign made in town, carved from good oak and painted with care. Ethan mounted it at the entrance to their property, and standing back to look at it, he felt a sense of pride and belonging he hadn't experienced since before the war. Summer arrived with its usual Montana intensity, hot days and cool nights, thunderstorms that rolled through without warning, grass growing tall and green across the valley. Eliza's belly swelled until she couldn't see her own feet. She moved with the careful grace of a woman carrying precious cargo, one hand often resting on her stomach as if reassuring the child within that all was well. Ethan found himself talking to the unborn baby, feeling slightly foolish but unable to stop. He'd tell the child about the ranch, about the cattle, about the mother who'd proven stronger than anyone had imagined. Eliza would watch him with soft eyes, occasionally laughing at his one-sided conversations. "What are you telling our daughter?" she asked one night as his hand rested on her belly. "How do you know it's a daughter?" "I don't, but I have a feeling." She covered his hand with hers. "And you didn't answer the question." "I was telling her about the flood, about how her mother was braver than any soldier I ever fought beside, how she didn't panic, didn't break, just did what needed doing." "You're going to make her think I'm some kind of legend." "You are a legend. My legend, at least." Eliza's labor began on a sweltering August afternoon while Ethan was in the north pasture checking fence. One of the ranch hands came galloping up, his young face pale with panic. "Mr. Cole, Mrs. Cole says it's time. Says you need to come now and bring the midwife." Ethan's heart stopped. They'd arranged for the midwife, a competent woman from town named Mrs. Henderson, to be on call, but that meant a 2-hour round-trip minimum. He'd known this moment was coming, had prepared for it as best he could, but the reality of it hit him like a physical blow. He rode harder than he'd ridden since the war, pushing Judge to his limits. He found Mrs. Henderson at her home, explained the situation in gasps, and had her mounted and riding back within minutes. Then he returned to the ranch, where Eliza was already in the grip of something ancient and powerful. The birth took 18 hours. Ethan spent most of it outside the bedroom, pacing like a caged animal, while Mrs. Henderson worked and Eliza labored. The sounds that came through the door, pain, effort, determination, nearly drove him mad. He'd faced battle without flinching, had stared down death more times than he could count, but listening to his wife suffer was a torture beyond anything he'd experienced. One of the ranch hands, an older man named Charlie who'd helped birth more calves than he could count, sat with Ethan through the ordeal. "First one's always the hardest," Charlie said, rolling a cigarette. "But your missus is tough. She'll come through fine." "How can you be sure?" "Because she survived everything else that's been thrown at her. Woman like that doesn't quit just because of a little thing like childbirth." The words helped, but only slightly. Ethan continued his pacing until finally, as dawn broke over the mountains, he heard a sound that stopped his heart completely. A baby crying. Mrs. Henderson opened the door, her face exhausted but smiling. "You have a daughter, Mr. Cole. A healthy, angry little girl who's already determined to make her presence known." Ethan pushed past her into the room. Eliza lay in the bed, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, her face pale with exhaustion. But she was smiling as she cradled a tiny bundle wrapped in clean blankets. "Come meet your daughter," she said softly. He approached as if walking on sacred ground. The baby was red-faced and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that seemed to look right through him. She was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Can I? He started. Of course you can. Eliza transferred the baby to his arms with practiced ease, though this was her first time too. She's yours as much as mine. Ethan held his daughter with trembling hands, terrified he might break her but unable to let go. She was so small, so impossibly fragile, yet she gripped his finger with surprising strength when he offered it. Hello, little one, he whispered. I'm your father, and I promise you, I will never let anything hurt you. I will give you everything I didn't have. Safety, stability, a home that's truly a home. I will love you and your mother with everything I am, every day for the rest of my life. The baby made a small sound, and Ethan felt something inside him shift permanently. The last pieces of the broken, angry man he'd been when Eliza first arrived dissolved completely. In their place was something new, not perfect, not without scars, but whole in ways that mattered. What should we name her? Eliza asked. They'd discussed names throughout the pregnancy, but never settled on anything. Now, looking at his daughter's face, Ethan knew. Sarah, he said. Sarah Hope Cole. For my first wife, who I'll always love, and for what this child represents, hope for the future. Eliza's eyes filled with tears. That's beautiful and generous. You honor the past while choosing the future. Is it all right with you? It's perfect. She reached up to touch his face. You're perfect. Broken and scarred and difficult, but perfect for me. Mrs. Henderson cleared her throat diplomatically. I'll give you folks some privacy. Mrs. Cole needs rest, and that baby will be wanting to feed soon. I'll check back in a few hours. After she left, Ethan settled carefully on the edge of the bed, still holding Sarah. Eliza leaned against him, exhausted but content. They sat together as the sun rose higher, painting the room in shades of gold. We did it, Eliza murmured. Against all odds, despite everything, we built this. We did. Ethan kissed her forehead. And we're just getting started. The weeks that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and endless wonder. Sarah proved to be a demanding baby, wanting to eat constantly and sleep in brief, unpredictable intervals. Ethan discovered depths of exhaustion he hadn't known existed, but he wouldn't have changed a moment of it. He found himself thinking often about the man he'd been just a year ago. The lonely cowboy who'd wanted nothing but isolation, who'd pushed away any possibility of connection or joy. That man seemed like a stranger now. This version of himself, sleep-deprived, covered in spit-ups, singing nonsense songs to a baby at 3 a.m, felt more real than anything he'd experienced since before the war. Eliza recovered her strength quickly, driven by the same determination that had helped her survive everything else. Within a month, she was back to light work around the ranch, Sarah strapped to her chest in a sling Ethan had fashioned from soft leather. The baby seemed content to be carried this way, watching the world with those intense dark eyes, taking in everything. Autumn arrived with its usual show of color, the aspens turning gold against the evergreens. Ethan and Eliza stood in their yard one evening, watching the sunset while Sarah slept in her father's arms. Do you ever think about how different things could have been? Eliza asked. If Hutchins had sent me to someone else? Or if you'd actually turned me away that first night? Sometimes. Usually late at night when I can't sleep and Sarah's finally quiet. He shifted the baby slightly, supporting her head. But then I think about everything that had to happen exactly as it did to get us here. All the bad choices, the pain, the near disasters, they all led to this moment. Do you regret any of it? I regret the pain you had to endure. I regret that Graves wasn't held accountable sooner. I regret the cattle we lost and the time we wasted being afraid. He looked down at his sleeping daughter. But if I could go back and change things, make it easier somehow, I'm not sure I would, because struggle taught us things comfort never could. It made us stronger than we had any right to be. That's a hard philosophy for someone who just became a father. Maybe, but I want Sarah to grow up understanding that life isn't easy, that worth comes from perseverance, that the best things are often the hardest won. He smiled slightly. Though I'd prefer she learns those lessons with slightly less drama than we experienced. Eliza laughed. Agreed. Maybe we can spare her the attempted murder and flash floods. Winter came again, their second on the ranch, but this time they were prepared. The barn was solid, the house was warm, and they had enough supplies to last through even the worst storms. More importantly, they had each other and the small, perfect life they'd created together. On Christmas morning, Ethan woke to find Eliza already up, feeding Sarah by the fire. The scene was so peaceful, so utterly domestic, that he had to pause and simply take it in. His wife, his daughter, his home. Everything he'd thought he'd lost forever, given back in a form he never could have predicted. "Merry Christmas," Eliza said softly, not wanting to wake the baby who'd just fallen back asleep. "Merry Christmas." Ethan joined them by the fire, wrapping his arms around both. "I know we didn't get each other gifts. We got each other this." She gestured around the cabin at the life they'd built. "What more could we possibly need?" "Nothing," he agreed. "Absolutely nothing." The years that followed proved both easier and harder than that first one. Sarah grew into a bright, curious child who seemed to inherit her mother's determination and her father's quiet intensity. When she was 2, Eliza announced she was pregnant again, this time with twins, boys who arrived screaming and hungry, turning the household into barely controlled chaos. James and William Cole were born in the spring of 1881, healthy and loud and demanding. Ethan named James for his brother who died at Gettysburg, and William for Eliza's father. The babies stretched their resources thin, but somehow they managed. The ranch hands helped. The neighboring homesteaders, more of whom had moved into the valley as the territory became more settled, pitched in. They'd become part of a community despite their isolation, respected for their hard work and honest dealing. Second Chance Ranch prospered. The cattle herd grew. The land that Ethan had nearly lost to poison and flood became productive and profitable. They added on to the cabin, building proper bedrooms for the children and a larger kitchen for Eliza. It would never be a mansion, but it was a home in every sense that mattered. One evening, when Sarah was 5 and the twins were toddling terrors, Eliza found Ethan sitting on the porch, where so much of their early relationship had developed. He was watching Sarah play in the yard while the boys napped inside. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, settling beside him. "Everything. Nothing. How lucky I am." He took her hand. "I keep waiting for it to feel normal, this happiness. But it never quite does. Every morning I wake up and I'm still surprised to find you beside me, to hear the children, to have this life." "Is that a bad thing?" "No, it's a good thing. It means I never take it for granted." He squeezed her hand. "I remember exactly how alone I was, how close I came to just giving up. And then you walked in bossy and determined, and everything changed." "I was terrified that night," Eliza admitted, "standing at your stove, pretending to be brave, while inside I was certain you'd throw me out. I had nowhere else to go, no backup plan. If you'd sent me away, but I didn't." "But you could have. You had every reason to." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "We were so broken, both of us. It's a miracle we didn't destroy each other. We nearly did a few times. But we didn't. We chose each other instead. Every day we keep choosing each other." Sarah ran up to the porch, her face flushed with play. "Papa, tell me the story again, about how you and Mama met." It had become her favorite bedtime story, a sanitized version of their meeting that left out the darker elements but kept the essential truth. Ethan pulled his daughter onto his lap. "Well, it was a dark and stormy night." "It wasn't stormy yet," Eliza interjected. "It was late afternoon and the storm was just building." "Fine. It was late afternoon and a storm was building, and I came home to find a strange woman cooking at my stove." "You weren't cooking," Sarah said to her mother. "You were just standing there being brave." "I was cooking," Eliza confirmed. "Beans and salt pork. Your father's favorite because he has simple tastes." "And she wouldn't leave even when I told her to," Ethan continued. "She just stood there and said no, and I was so surprised that a woman would dare talk back to me that I let her stay." "That's not how it happened," Eliza protested, laughing. "That's exactly how it happened. And then we worked together to save the ranch from bad men and bad weather and our own stubbornness, and eventually we realized we loved each other." "And then you got married and had me," Sarah finished triumphantly. "That's right. And then we had you and then your brothers, and now we have this perfect, chaotic, wonderful life." Sarah considered this seriously. "Was Mama really ruined like Uncle Charlie says?" Both adults froze. Ethan glared toward the barn, where Charlie was probably finishing evening chores. making a mental note to have words with the old ranch hand about appropriate conversations around children. Your mother was never ruined, Ethan said firmly. She was hurt by people who didn't deserve her, but that didn't make her less. It made her stronger, and anyone who says otherwise can answer to me. Okay, Sarah seemed satisfied with this explanation. She wiggled off his lap. Can I go play some more before supper? Wash your hands first, and stay where we can see you. Sarah ran off, already calling for her brothers, who'd apparently woken from their nap. Eliza watched her go, then turned to Ethan with tears in her eyes. Thank you, she said quietly, for defending me, for making sure she grows up knowing that what happened to me doesn't define who I am. It's the truth. Besides, I want our children to understand that people are more than their worst moments or their biggest mistakes, that redemption is possible, that love can heal things we thought were broken beyond repair. When did you get so wise? When I had a good teacher. He pulled her close. You taught me all of that, you know. Taught me that walls don't protect you. They just keep you alone. That vulnerability isn't weakness. That choosing to hope, to trust, to love again despite everything, that's the bravest thing anyone can do. They sat together as the light faded, watching their children play in the yard of Second Chance Ranch. The mountains stood eternal in the distance. The grass whispered in the evening breeze, and smoke rose from the chimney of their home. Ethan thought back to that day so long ago when he'd ridden home to find smoke rising from that same chimney, announcing an intruder who would become everything to him. He remembered the anger, the suspicion, the determination to remain alone. He remembered the broken man who believed isolation was safety. That man was gone now, replaced by someone who understood that the greatest courage wasn't surviving alone. It was opening yourself to the possibility of loss by loving someone completely, by building a life that could be taken away, but choosing to build it anyway because the alternative was no life at all. Do you ever miss it? Eliza asked suddenly. The solitude? The simplicity of life before I complicated everything? Never, Ethan said without hesitation. Not even once. You didn't complicate my life, Eliza. You gave it meaning. You gave it purpose beyond just existing day to day. You gave me a future worth fighting for. Good answer. She kissed him softly. Because you're stuck with me now. Best thing that ever happened to me. Years continued to pass. Sarah grew into a young woman with her mother's steel spine and her father's quiet determination. The twins became strong boys who worked the ranch alongside their father, learning the skills they'd need to run it themselves someday. The ranch prospered, gaining a reputation throughout the territory for quality cattle and honest dealing. Bitter Creek grew into a proper town, with a railroad connection and new businesses. The old scandals faded into history, replaced by new dramas. Thomas Graves left the territory entirely, last heard working as a clerk in Portland, a fall from grace that seemed almost poetic. Mayor Hutchins retired. The people who judged Eliza so harshly either forgot their judgment or died off, replaced by new arrivals who only knew her as Mrs. Cole, the respected rancher's wife. Eliza herself became something of a legend in the valley. She served as midwife to dozens of births, drawing on her experience to help other women through the ordeal. She organized the first school in the area, teaching children from neighboring ranches until the territory could afford to send a proper teacher. She proved that being dismissed and discarded by one community didn't mean you couldn't build something meaningful in another. On their 20th anniversary, Ethan and Eliza stood in that same spot on the porch where so much of their story had unfolded. Their children were grown or nearly so. The ranch was solid, successful, a legacy they'd built from nothing. 20 years, Eliza marveled. Sometimes it feels like yesterday you were pointing a gun at me and ordering me out of your cabin. My finest moment, Ethan agreed dryly, though in my defense, you were an intruder. An intruder you couldn't live without. True enough. He wrapped his arms around her, and they watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. If I could go back and tell that angry, lonely man what was coming, the love, the children, the life we'd build, he'd never believe it. Would you change anything if you could go back? Ethan thought about it seriously. I'd tell you I loved you sooner. I'd propose properly the first time instead of waiting until I was dying. I'd be less stubborn about accepting help. He paused. But the pain, the struggle, the near disasters, no, I wouldn't change those. They made us who we are. Even Thomas Graves? Even him. Because if he hadn't betrayed you, you never would have come here. You wouldn't have become mine, and I wouldn't have become yours. And our children wouldn't exist. He turned her to face him. I hate what he put you through. I'll hate him until the day I die for causing you pain. But I can't regret the path that brought you to me. Eliza kissed him, deep and long, with all the passion of 2 decades of choosing each other every single day. When they broke apart, both were smiling. We did good, didn't we? She said. Despite everything, against all odds, we built something that matters. We built something that lasts, Ethan agreed. Something our children will inherit and pass on to their children. Second Chance Ranch isn't just land and cattle. It's proof that broken people can heal, that love is stronger than betrayal, that choosing hope over despair can change everything. As darkness fell over the Montana Valley, Ethan Cole, once the loneliest man in the territory, stood surrounded by everything that mattered. His wife beside him, his children grown strong and capable, his legacy secured. The woman no one wanted had become the foundation of everything he valued. The ranch no one believed in had become a landmark of perseverance and success. What had begun in desperation became belonging. What had begun in survival became legacy. 2 damaged souls who'd found each other in the harsh Montana wilderness had proven that second chances weren't just possible. They were worth every hardship required to claim them. The cabin lights glowed warm against the gathering night. Somewhere inside, their grandchildren would soon be playing. The cycle would continue, each generation building on what came before, carrying forward the story of the lonely cowboy and the woman no one wanted who became the mother of his future. It was a good story, an honest story, a story worth telling for generations to come. And as Ethan held Eliza close under the vast Montana sky, he understood that this was what redemption looked like. Not perfection, not the absence of scars, but the choice to keep building, keep loving, keep hoping, even when the world gave you every reason to give up. They had chosen each other. They had chosen hope. They had chosen to believe in tomorrow despite everything yesterday had taken from them. And that choice had made all the difference.